Introduction of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Brooke Favorite, www.alongsidemom.com. An Address to the Inhabitants of the United States of America. At a period when every manly arm was occupied, and every trait of talent or activity engaged, either in the cabinet or the field, apprehensive that amidst the sudden convulsions, crowded scenes, and rapid changes that flowed in quick succession, many circumstances might escape the more busy and active members of society, I have been induced to improve the leisure Providence had lent, to record as they passed, in the following pages, the new and unexperienced events exhibited in a land previously blessed with peace, liberty, simplicity, and virtue. As circumstances were collected, facts related, and characters drawn, many years antecedent to any history since published, relative to the dismemberment of the colonies, and to American independence, there are few allusions to any later writers. Connected by nature, friendship, and every social tie with many of the first patriots and most influential characters on the continent, in the habits of confidential and epistolary intercourse with several gentlemen employed abroad in the most distinguished stations, and with others since elevated to the highest grades of rank and distinction, I had the best means of information, through a long period that the colonies were in suspense, waiting the operation of foreign courts and the success of their own enterprising spirit. The solemnity that covered every countenance when contemplating the sword uplifted, and the horrors of civil war rushing to habitations not injured to scenes of rapine and misery, even to the quiet cottage, where only concord and affection had reigned, stimulated to observation a mind that had not yielded to the assertion that all political attentions lay out of the road of female life. It is true there are certain appropriate duties assigned to each sex, and doubtless it is the mere peculiar province of masculine strength not only to repel the bold invader of the rights of his country and of mankind, but in the nervous style of manly eloquence, to describe the blood-stained field and relate the story of slaughtered armies. Sensible of this, the trembling heart has recoiled at the magnitude of the undertaking, and the hand often shrunk back from the task. Yet, recollecting that every domestic enjoyment depends on the unimpaired possession of civil and religious liberty, that a concern for the welfare of society ought equally to glow in every human breast, the work was not relinquished. The most interesting circumstances were collected, active characters portrayed, the principles of the times developed, and the changes marked, nor need it cause a blush to acknowledge, a detail was preserved with a view of transmitting it to the rising youth of my country, some of them in infancy, others in the European world, while the most interesting events lowered over their native land. Conscious that truth has been the guide of my pen, and candor as well as justice the accompaniment of my wishes through every page, I can say with an ingenious writer, I have used my pen with the liberty of one who neither hopes nor fears, nor has any interest in the success or failure of any party, and who speaks to posterity, perhaps very far remote. The sympathizing heart has looked abroad and wept the many victims of affliction, inevitably such in consequence of civil feuds and the concomitant miseries of war, either foreign or domestic. The reverses of life and the instability of the world have been viewed on the point of both extremes. Their delusory nature and character have been contemplated as becomes the philosopher and the Christian. The one teaches us from the analogies of nature the necessity of changes, decay, and death. The other strengthens the mind to meet them with the rational hope of revival and renovation. Several years have elapsed since the historical tracts, now with diffidence submitted to the public, have been arranged in their present order. Local circumstances, the decline of health, temporary deprivations of sight, the death of the most amiable of children, the shaft flew thrice, and thrice my peace was slain, have sometimes prompted to throw by the pen in despair. I draw a veil over the woe-fraught scenes that have pierced my own heart. While the soul was melting inwardly, it has endeavored to support outwardly, with decency and dignity, those accidents which admit of no redress, and to exert that spirit that enables to get the better of those that do. Not indifferent to the opinion of the world, nor servilely courting its smiles, no further apology is offered for the attempt, though many may be necessary, for the incomplete execution of a design that had rectitude for its basis, and a beneficent regard for the civil and religious rights of mankind for its motive. The liberal-minded will peruse with candor rather than criticize with severity, nor will they think it necessary that any apology should be offered for sometimes introducing characters nearly connected with the author of the following annals, as they were early and zealously attached to the public cause, uniform in their principles, and constantly active in the great scenes that produced the Revolution and obtained independence for their country. Truth precludes that reserve which might have been proper on less important occasions, and forbids to pass over in silence the names of such as expired before the conflict was finished, or have since retired from public scenes. The historian has never laid aside the tenderness of the sex or the friend. At the same time she has endeavored, on all occasions, that the strictest veracity should govern her heart, and the most exact impartiality be the guide of her pen. If the work should be so far useful or entertaining as to obtain the sanction of the generous and virtuous part of the community, I cannot but be highly gratified and amply rewarded for the effort, soothed at the same time with the idea that the motives were justifiable in the eye of omniscience. Then, if it should not escape the remarks of the critic, or the censure of party, I shall feel no wound to my sensibility, but repose on my pillow as quietly as ever, while all the defiant din the world can keep rolls o'er my grotto, and but soothes my sleep. Before this address to my countrymen is closed, I beg leave to observe that as a new century has dawned upon us, the mind is naturally led to contemplate the great events that have run parallel with and have just closed the last. From the revolutionary spirit of the times, the vast improvements in science, arts, and agriculture, the boldness of genius that marks the age, the investigation of new theories, and the changes in the political, civil, and religious characters of men, succeeding generations have reason to expect still more astonishing exhibitions in the next. In the meantime, Providence has clearly pointed out the duties of the present generation, particularly the paths which Americans ought to tread. The United States form a young republic, a confederacy which ought ever to be cemented by a union of interests and affection, under the influence of those principles which obtained their independence. These have, indeed, at certain periods appeared to be in the wane, but let them never be eradicated by the jarring interests of parties, jealousies of the sister states, or the ambition of individuals. It has been observed by a writer of celebrity that people, government, and constitution is the freest, which makes the best provision for the enacting of expedient and salutary laws. May this truth be evinced to all ages by the wise and salutary laws that shall be enacted in the federal legislature of America. May the hands of the executive of their own choice be strengthened more by the unanimity and affection of the people than by the dread of penal inflictions or any restraints that might repress free inquiry relative to the principles of their own government and the conduct of its administrators. The world is now viewing America as experimenting a new system of government, a federal republic, including a territory to which the kingdoms of Great Britain and Ireland bear little proportion. The practicability of supporting such a system has been doubted by some. If she succeeds, it will refute the assertion that none but small states are adapted to republican government. If she does not, and the Union should be dissolved, some ambitious son of Columbia, or some foreign adventurer, allured by the prize, may wade to empire through seas of blood, or the friends of monarchy may see a number of petty despots stretching their scepters over the disjointed parts of the continent. Thus, by the mandate of a single sovereign, the degraded subjects of one state, under the bannerets of royalty, may be dragged to sheathe their swords in the bosoms of the inhabitants of another. The state of the public mind appears at present to be prepared to weigh these reflections with solemnity, and to receive with pleasure an effort to trace the origin of the American Revolution, to review the characters that affected it, and to justify the principles of the defection and final separation from the parent state. With an expanded heart, beating with high hopes of the continued freedom and prosperity of America, the writer indulges a modest expectation that the following pages will be perused with kindness and candor. This she claims, both in consideration of her sex, the uprightness of her intentions, and the fervency of her wishes for the happiness of all the human race. Mercy Warren, Plymouth, Massachusetts, March, 1805. End of An Address to the Inhabitants of the United States of America.
Section 1 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 1, Introductory Observations. History, the deposit of crimes, and the record of everything disgraceful or honorary to mankind, requires a just knowledge of character, to investigate the sources of action, a clear comprehension, to review the combination of causes, and precision of language, to detail the events that have produced the most remarkable revolutions, to analyze the secret springs that have affected the progressive changes in society, to trace the origin of the various modes of government, the consequent improvements in science, in morality, or the national tincture that marks the manners of the people on despotic or more liberal forms, is a bold and adventurous work. The study of the human character opens at once a beautiful and a deformed picture of the soul. We there find a noble principle implanted in the nature of man that pants for distinction. This principle operates in every bosom, and when kept under the control of reason and the influence of humanity, it produces the most benevolent effects. But when the checks of conscience are thrown aside, or the moral sense weakened by the sudden acquisition of wealth or power, humanity is obscured, and if a favorable coincidence of circumstances permits, this love of distinction often exhibits the most mortifying instances of profligacy, tyranny, and the wanton exercise of arbitrary sway. Thus, when we look over the theater of human action, scrutinize the windings of the heart, and survey the transactions of man from the earliest to the present period, it must be acknowledged that ambition and avarice are the leading springs which generally actuate the restless mind. From these primary sources of corruption have arisen all the rapine and confusion, the depredation and the ruin that have spread distress over the face of the earth from the days of Nimrod to Caesar, and from Caesar to an arbitrary prince of the House of Brunswick. The indulgence of these turbulent passions has depopulated the cities, laid waste the finest territories, and turned the beauty and harmony of the lower creation into an aceldama. Yet candor must bear honorable testimony to many signal instances of disinterested merit among the children of men. Thus it is not possible to pronounce decidedly on the character of the politician or the statesman till the winding up of the drama. To evince the truth of this remark, it is needless to adduce innumerable instances of deception, both in ancient and modern story. It is enough to observe that the specious Augustus established himself an empire by the appearance of justice, clemency, and moderation, while the savage Nero shamelessly weltered in the blood of the citizens. But the sole object of each was to become the sovereign of life and property, and to govern the Roman world with a despotic hand. Time may unlock the cabinets of princes, unfold the secret negotiations of statesmen, and hand down the immortal characters of dignified worth, or the blackened traits of finished villainy in exaggerated colors. The truth is most likely to be exhibited by the general sense of contemporaries, when the feelings of the heart can be expressed without suffering itself to be disguised by the prejudices of the man. Yet it is not easy to convey to posterity a just idea of the embarrassed flirtation of the Western world, previous to the rupture with Britain, the dismemberment of the empire, and the loss of the most industrious, flourishing, and perhaps virtuous colonies ever planted by the hand of man. The progress of the American Revolution has been so rapid, and such the alteration of manners, the blending of characters, and the new train of ideas that almost universally prevail, that the principles which animated to the noblest exertions have been nearly annihilated. Many who first stepped forth in vindication of the rights of human nature are forgotten, and the causes which involved the 13 colonies in confusion and blood are scarcely known, amidst the rage of accumulation and the taste for expensive pleasures that have since prevailed. A taste that has abolished that mediocrity which once satisfied, and that contentment which long smiled in every countenance. Luxury, the companion of young, acquired wealth, is usually the consequence of opposition to, or close connection with, opulent commercial states. Thus the hurry of spirits that ever attends the eager pursuit of fortune and a passion for splendid enjoyment leads to forgetfulness, and thus the inhabitants of America cease to look back with due gratitude and respect on the fortitude and virtue of their ancestors, who, through difficulties almost insurmountable, planted them in a happy soil. But the historian and the philosopher will ever venerate the memory of those pious and independent gentlemen who, after suffering innumerable impositions, restrictions, and penalties, less for political than theological opinions, left England, not as adventurers for wealth or fame, but for the quiet enjoyment of religion and liberty. The love of domination and an uncontrolled lust of arbitrary power have prevailed among all nations, and perhaps in proportion to the degrees of civilization. They have been equally conspicuous in the decline of Roman virtue and in the dark pages of British story. It was these principles that overturned that ancient republic. It was these principles that frequently involved England in civil feuds. It was the resistance to them that brought one of their monarchs to the block and struck another from his throne. It was the prevalence of them that drove the first settlers of America from elegant habitations and affluent circumstances to seek an asylum in the cold and uncultivated regions of the Western world. Oppressed in Britain by despotic kings, and persecuted by prelatic fury, they fled to a distant country, where the desires of men were bounded by the wants of nature, where civilization had not created those artificial cravings which too frequently break over every moral and religious tie for their gratification. The tyranny of the Stuart race has long been proverbial in English story. Their efforts to establish an arbitrary system of government began with the weak and bigoted reign of James I, and were continued until the accession of his son Charles. The contest between the British Parliament and this unfortunate monarch arose to such a height as to augur an alarming defection of many of the best subjects in England. Great was their uneasiness at the state of public affairs, the arbitrary stretch of power, and the obstinacy of King Charles, who pursued his own despotic measures in spite of the opposition of a number of gentlemen in Parliament attached to the liberties and privileges of Englishmen. Thus the spirit of emigration, adopted in the preceding reign, began to spread with great rapidity through the nation. Some gentlemen endowed with talents to defend their rights by the most cogent and restless arguments were among the number who had taken the alarming resolution of seeking an asylum far from their natal soil, where they might enjoy the rights and privileges they claimed, and which they considered on the eve of annihilation at home. Among these were Oliver Cromwell, afterwards Protector, and a number of other gentlemen of distinguished name, who had actually engaged to embark for New England. This was a circumstance so alarming to the court that they were stopped by an order of government, and by royal edict all further emigration was forbidden. The spirit of colonization was not, however, much impeded, nor the growth of the young plantations prevented, by the arbitrary resolutions of the court. It was but a short time after this effort to check them, before numerous English immigrants were spread along the borders of the Atlantic from Plymouth to Virginia. The independency with which these colonists acted, the high promise of future advantage from the beauty and fertility of the country, and, as was observed soon after, the prosperous state of their settlements, made it to be considered by the heads of the Puritan party in England, many of whom were men of the first rank, fortune, and abilities, as the sanctuary of liberty. The order above alluded to indeed prevented the embarkation of the Lords Say and Brooke, the Earl of Warwick, of Hampton, Pym, and many others, who, despairing of recovering their civil and religious liberty on their native shore, had determined to secure it by a retreat to the New World, as it was then called. Patents were purchased by others within a short period after the present, who planted the 13 American colonies with a successful hand. Many circumstances concurred to awaken the spirit of adventure, and to draw out men, inured to softer habits, to encounter the difficulties and dangers of planting themselves and families in the wilderness. The spirit of party had thrown accumulated advantages into the hands of Charles II after his restoration. The divisions and animosities at court render it more easy for him to pursue the same system which his father had adopted. Amidst the rage for pleasure, and the licentious manners that prevailed in his court, the complacence of one party, the fears of another, and the weariness of all, of the dissensions and difficulties that had arisen under the protectorship of Cromwell, facilitated the measures of the high monarchists, who continually improved their advantages to enhance the prerogatives of the crown. The weak and bigoted conduct of his brother James increased the general uneasiness of the nation until his abdication. Thus, through every successive reign of this line of the Stuarts, the colonies gained additional strength by continual emigrations to the young American settlements. The first colony of Europeans permanently planted in North America was by a handful of roving strangers, sickly, and necessitated to debark on the first land, where there was any promise of a quiet subsistence. Amidst the despotism of the first branch of the House of Stuart on the throne of Britain, and the ecclesiastical persecutions in England, which sent many eminent characters abroad, a small company of dissenters from the national establishment left England, under the pastoral care of the pious and learned Mr. Robinson, and resided a short time in Holland, which they left in the beginning of autumn, 1620. After a long and hazardous voyage, they landed on the borders of an inhospitable wilderness in the dreary month of December, amidst the horrors of a North American winter. Footnote. The reader's curiosity may be gratified by the perusal of a few particulars relative to the Plymouth settlers, from their earliest memorials. 101 persons left Holland, all of whom arrived at Plymouth in the month of December, 1620. From the sufferings and hardships they sustained, more than half their number died before the end of March, 1621. On the borders of a forlorn wilderness, without any governmental restrictions, they thought it necessary to adopt some measures for order and subordination. They voluntarily, on their arrival at Cape Cod, entered into covenant for their necessary purpose. It was a short code, but replete with rules of equity and authority, sufficient to maintain peace among themselves in their infant state, 41 persons affixed their names to the instrument, but at the end of 4 months, only 20 of them were living. These were John Carver, their first governor, William Bradford II, and Edward Winslow, the third Captain Miles Standish, who had been an experienced military officer in the Netherlands, Richard Warren, eminently useful in the establishment of the new colony. He lived only to the year 1628. John Alden, Samuel Fuller, William Brewster, Isaac Allington, Stephen Hopkins, Gilbert Winslow, Peter Brown, Richard Gardner, John Howlands, Francis Cook, John Burlington, Francis Eaton, Edward Doty, George Soule, Edward Lizer. Several weeks elapsed after their arrival at Plymouth before they saw any of the natives. About the middle of March, an Indian chief named Samoset appeared and abruptly exclaimed, "Welcome, English." This Indian had formerly been a prisoner to some Europeans and had learned a little of their language. By him they found that a pestilence had raged among the bordering nations that had swept them all off within the limits of Cape Cod and Braintree Bay 2 or 3 years before. This was corroborated by the vast number of graves and sepulchral mounds and holes they had observed, in which the dead were interred. In all the grounds they had explored, Samoset informed them that Massasoit was a neighboring chief who held jurisdiction over several other tribes. This induced the English to send him a friendly message by Samoset, which was faithfully delivered. The great Sachem soon came forward in an amicable manner, and entered into a treaty of peace with this handful of strangers. In the next autumn, an addition of 35 persons from the Leyden congregation arrived at Cape Cod. They soon found their associates at Plymouth patient, pious, and contented, though they could set nothing on their board but a lobster, cold water, and a scanty pittance of Indian bread, for the entertainment of their countrymen recently arrived, to share with them the difficulties and dangers of planting settlements in the wilderness, at a vast distance from the civilized world, and surrounded by hordes of hostile nations of terrific form and barbarous manners. End of footnote. They were at first received by the savage inhabitants of the country with a degree of simple humanity. They smoked with them the calumet of peace, purchased a tract of the uncultivated waste, hutted on the frozen shore, sheltered only by the lofty forest that had been left for ages to thicken under the rude hand of time. From this small beginning was laid the stable foundations of those extensive settlements that have since spread over the fairest quarter of the globe. Virginia, indeed, had been earlier discovered by Sir Walter Raleigh, and a few men left there by him, to whom additions under various adventures were afterwards made. But, by a series of misfortunes and misconduct, the plantation had fallen into such disorder and distress that the enterprise was abandoned. The fate of those left there by this great and good man has never been known with certainty. It is probable most of them were murdered by the savages, and the remnant, if any there were, became incorporated with the barbarous nations. There was afterwards a more successful effort for the settlement of a colony in Virginia. In the beginning of the 17th century, Lord Delaware was appointed governor, and with him a considerable number of emigrants arrived from England. But his health was not equal to a residence in a rude and uncultivated wilderness. He soon returned to his native country, but left his son, with Sir Thomas Gates and several other enterprising gentlemen, who pursued the project of an establishment in Virginia, and began to build a town on James River in the year 1606. Thus was the state entitled to the prescriptive term of the Old Dominion, which it still maintains. But their difficulties, misfortunes, and disappointments long prevented any permanent constitution or stable government, and they scarcely deserved the appellation of a regular colony until a considerable time after the settlement in Plymouth, in 1620. The discovery of the New World had opened a wide field of enterprise, and several other previous attempts had been made by Europeans to obtain settlements therein. Yet little of a permanent nature was effected until the patience and perseverance of the latent sufferers laid the foundation of social order. This small company of settlers, after wandering some time on the frozen shore, fixed themselves at the bottom of the Massachusetts Bay. Though dispirited by innumerable discouraging circumstances, they immediately entered into engagements with each other to form themselves into a regular society, and drew up a covenant by which they bound themselves to submit in order and subordination. Their jurisprudence was marked with wisdom and dignity, and their simplicity and piety were displayed equally in the regulation of their police, the nature of their contracts, and the punctuality of observance. The Old Plymouth colony remained for some time a distinct government. They chose their own magistrates, independent of all foreign control, but a few years involved them with the Massachusetts of which Boston, more recently settled than Plymouth, was the capital. From the local situation of a country, separated by an ocean of 1,000 leagues from the parent state, and surrounded by a world of savages, an immediate compact with the King of Great Britain was thought necessary. Thus a charter was early granted, stipulating on the part of the Crown that the Massachusetts should have a legislative body within itself, composed of 3 branches and subject to no control, except His Majesty's negative, within a limited term, to any laws formed by their assembly that might be thought to militate with the general interest of the realm of England. The governor was appointed by the Crown, the representative body, annually chosen by the people, and the council elected by the representatives from the people at large. End of section 1. Section 2 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 1, continued. Though more liberal charters were granted to some of the colonies, which, after the first settlement of Plymouth, rapidly spread over the face of this new discovered country, yet modes of government nearly similar to that of Massachusetts were established in most of them, except Maryland and Pennsylvania, which were under the direction of particular proprietors. But the corrupt principles which had been fashionable in the voluptuous and bigoted courts of the Stuarts soon followed the emigrants in their distant retreat, and interrupted the establishments of their civil police, which, it may be observed, were a mixture of Jewish theocracy, monarchic government, and the growing principles of republicanism, which had taken root in Britain as early as the days of Elizabeth. It soon appeared that there was a strong party in England who wished to govern the colonists with a rigorous hand. They discovered their inclinations by repeated attempts to procure a revision, an alteration, and a resumption of charters on the most frivolous pretenses. It is true, an indiscreet zeal with regard to several religious sectaries, which had early introduced themselves into the young settlements, gave a pretext to some severities from the parent state. But the conduct of the first planters of the American colonies has been held up by some ingenious writers in too ludicrous a light. Yet while we admire their persevering and self-denying virtues, we must acknowledge that the illiberality and weakness of some of their municipal regulations have cast a shade over the memory of men, whose errors arose more from the fashion of the times and the dangers which threatened them from every side, than from any deficiency either in the head or the heart. but the treatment of the Quakers in the Massachusetts can never be justified either by the principles of policy or humanity. Footnote: however censurable the early settlers in New England were in their severities towards the Quakers and other nonconformists, they might think their conduct in some degree sanctioned by the example of their parent state and the rigors exercised in other parts of the European world at that time against all denominations which differed from the religious establishments of government. End of footnote. The demeanor of these people was indeed in many instances not only ridiculous, but disorderly and atrocious, yet an indelible stain will be left on the names of those who were judged to imprisonment, confiscation, and death, a sect made considerable only by opposition. In the story of the sufferings of these enthusiasts, there has never been a just discrimination between the sectaries denominated Quakers, who first visited the New England settlements, and the associates of the celebrated Penn, who, having received a patent from the Crown of England, fixed his residence on the borders of the Delaware. He there reared, with astonishing rapidity, a flourishing, industrious colony, on the most benevolent principles. The equality of their condition, the mildness of their deportment, and the simplicity of their manners encouraged the emigration of husbandmen, artisans, and manufacturers from all parts of Europe. Thus was this colony soon raised to distinguished eminence, though under a proprietary government. Footnote: Mr. Penn published a system of government on which it has been observed that the introductory piece is perhaps the most extraordinary compound that was ever published, or enthusiasm, found policy, and good sense. The author tells us it was adapted to the great end of all government, viz., to support power in reverence with the people, and to secure the people from the abuse of power. End of footnote. But the sectaries that infested the more eastern territory were generally loose, idle, and refractory, aiming to introduce confusion and licentiousness rather than the establishment of any regular society. Excluded from Boston and banished to Massachusetts, they repaired to a neighboring colony, less tenacious in religious opinion, by which the growth of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation was greatly facilitated. The spirit of intolerance in the early stages of their settlements was not confined to the New England Puritans, as they have in derision been styled. In Virginia, Maryland, and some other colonies, where the votaries of the Church of England were the stronger party, the dissenters of every description were persecuted, with little less rigor than had been experienced by the Quakers from the Presbyterians of the Massachusetts. An act passed in the Assembly of Virginia in early days of her legislation, making it penal for any master of a vessel to bring a Quaker into the province. The inhabitants were inhibited from entertaining any person of that denomination. They were imprisoned, banished, and treated with every mark of severity short of death. It is natural to suppose a society of men who had suffered so much from a spirit of religious bigotry would have stretched a lenient hand towards any who might differ from themselves, either in mode or opinion, with regard to the worship of the deity. But from a strange propensity in human nature to reduce everything within the vortex of their own ideas, the same intolerant and persecuting spirit, from which they had so recently fled, discovered itself in those bold adventurers who had braved the dangers of the ocean and planted themselves in a wilderness for the enjoyment of civil and religious liberty. In the cool moments of reflection, both humanity and philosophy revolt at the diabolical disposition that has prevailed in almost every country to persecute such as either from education or principle, from caprice or custom, refuse to subscribe to the religious creed of those who, by various adventitious circumstances, have acquired a degree of superiority or power. It is rational to believe that the benevolent author of nature designed universal happiness as the basis of his works, nor is it unphilosophical to suppose the difference in human sentiment and the variety of opinions among mankind may conduce to this end. They may be permitted in order to improve the faculty of thinking, to draw out the powers of the mind, to exercise the principles of candor, and learn us to wait, in a becoming manner, the full disclosure of the system of divine government. Thus, probably, the variety in the formation of the human soul may appear to be such as to have rendered it impossible for mankind to think exactly in the same channel. The contemplative and liberal-minded man must, therefore, blush for the weakness of his own species, when he sees any of them endeavoring to circumscribe the limits of virtue and happiness within his own contracted sphere, too often darkened by superstition and bigotry. The modern improvements in society and the cultivation of reason, which has spread its benign influence over both the European and the American world, have nearly eradicated this persecuting spirit, and we look back in both countries, mortified and ashamed of the illiberality of our ancestors. Yet such is the elasticity of the human mind, that when it has been long bent beyond a certain line of propriety, it frequently flies off to the opposite extreme. Thus there may be danger that in the enthusiasm for toleration, indifference to all religion may take place. Footnote. Since these annals were written, this observation has been fully verified in the impious sentiments and conduct of several members of the National Convention of France, who, after the dissolution of monarchy and the abolition of the privileged orders, were equally zealous for the destruction of the altars of God and the annihilation of all religion. End of footnote. Perhaps few will deny that religion, viewed merely in a political light, is after all the best cement of society, the great barrier of just government, and the only certain restraint of the passions, those dangerous inlets to licentiousness and anarchy. It has been observed by an ingenious writer that there are proselytes from atheism, but none from superstition. Would it not be more just to reverse the observation? The narrowness of superstition frequently wears off by an intercourse with the world, and the subjects become useful members of society. But the hardiness of atheism sets at defiance both human and divine laws, until the man is lost to himself and to the world. A cursory survey of the religious state of America in the early stages of colonization requires no apology. It is necessary to observe the animosities which arose among themselves on external forms of worship and different modes of thinking were most unfortunate circumstances for the infant settlements, more especially while kept in continual alarm by the natives of the vast uncultivated wilds, who soon grew jealous of their new inmates. It is true that Massasoit, the principal chief of the North, had received the strangers with the same mildness and hospitality that marked the conduct of Montezuma at the South on the arrival of the Spaniards in his territories. Perhaps the different demeanor of their sons, Philip and Gatamozin, was not the result of more hostile or heroic dispositions than their fathers possessed. It more probably arose from an apprehension of the invasion of their rights, after time had given them a more perfect knowledge of the temper of their guests. It may be a mistake that man, in a state of nature, is more disposed to cruelty than courtesy. Many instances might be adduced to prove the contrary, but when once awakened to suspicion that either his life or his interest is in danger, all the black passions of the mind, with revenge in their rear, rise up in their way. Footnote. A celebrated writer has observed that moral evil is foreign to man as well as physical evil. that both the one and the other spring up out of deviations from the law of nature. End of footnote. It is an undoubted truth that both the rude savage and the polished citizen are equally tenacious of their pecuniary acquisitions. And however mankind may have trifled away liberty, virtue, religion, or life, yet when the first rudiments of society have been established, the right of private property has been held sacred. For an attempt to invade the possessions each one denominates his own, whether it is made by the rude hand of the savage or by the refinements of ancient or modern policy, little short of the blood of the aggressor has been thought a sufficient atonement. Thus, the purchase of their commodities, the furs of the forest, and the alienation of their lands for trivial considerations, the assumed superiority of the Europeans, their knowledge of arts and war, and perhaps the supercilious deportment towards the aborigines, might awaken in them just fears of extermination. Nor is it strange that the natural principle of self-defense operated strongly in their minds, and urged them to hostilities that often reduced the young colonies to the utmost danger and distress. But the innumerable swarms of the wilderness, who were not driven back to the vast interior region, were soon swept off by the sword or by sickness, which remarkably raged among them about the time of the arrival of the English. Footnote. The Plymouth settlers landed the 22nd of December, but saw not an Indian until the 31st of January. This was afterwards accounted for by the information of Samoset, an Indian chief who visited them, and told them the natives on the borders had been all swept away by a pestilence that raged among them than 3 or 4 years before. End of footnote. The few who remained were quieted by treaty or by conquest, after which the inhabitants of the American colonies lived many years, perhaps, as near the point of felicity as the condition of human nature will admit. The religious bigotry of the first planters, and the temporary ferments it had occasioned, subsided, and a spirit of candor and forbearance everywhere took place. They seemed, previous to the rupture with Britain, to have acquired that just and happy medium between the ferocity of a state of nature and those high stages of civilization and refinement that at once corrupt the heart and sap the foundation of happiness. The sobriety of their manners and the purity of their morals were exemplary, their piety and hospitality engaging, and the equal and lenient administration of their government secured authority, subordination, justice, regularity, and peace. A well-informed yeomanry and an enlightened peasantry evinced the early attention of the first settlers to domestic education. Public schools were established in every town, particularly in the eastern provinces, and as early as 1638, Harvard College was founded at Cambridge. Footnote. The elegant St. Pierre has observed that there are 3 periods through which most nations pass. The first below nature, in the second they come up to her, and in third go beyond her. End of footnote. In the southern colonies it is true that there was not that general attention to early instruction. The children of the opulent planters only were educated in England, while the less affluent were neglected, and the common class of whites had little education above their slaves. Both knowledge and property were more equally divided in the colder regions of the North. Consequently, a spirit of more equal liberty was diffused, while the almost spontaneous harvest of the warmer latitudes, the great number of slaves thought necessary to secure their produce, and the early acquisition of fortune, nourished more aristocratic principles. Perhaps it may be true that wherever slavery is encouraged, there are among the free inhabitants very high ideas of liberty, though not so much from a sense of the common rights of man as from their own feelings of superiority. Democratic principles are the result of equality of condition, a superfluity of wealth, and a train of domestic slaves naturally banish a sense of general liberty, and nourished the seeds of that kind of independence that usually terminates in aristocracy. Yet all America, from the first immigrants to the present generation, felt an attachment to the inhabitants, a regard to the interest, and a reverence for the laws and government of England. Those writers who observed that these principles had scarcely any existence in the colonies at the commencement of the late war have certainly mistaken the character of their country. But unhappily, both for Great Britain and America, the encroachments of the crown had gathered strength by time, and after the successes, the glory, and the demise of George II, the sceptre descended to a prince, bred under the auspices of a Scotch nobleman of the House of Stuart, nurtured in all the inflated ideas of kingly prerogative, surrounded by flatterers and dependents, who always swarm in the purlieus of a palace. This misguided sovereign, dazzled with the acquisition of empire in the morning of youth and in the zenith of national prosperity, more obstinate than cruel, rather weak than remarkably wicked, confided in opposition to the mandates of his ministers, as a crime of too daring a nature to hope for the pardon of royalty. Lord Bute, who, from the preceptor of the prince in the years of pupilage, had become the director of the monarch on the throne of Britain, found it not difficult, by that secret influence ever exercised by a favorite minister, to bring over a majority of the House of Commons to cooperate with the designs of the crown. Thus the Parliament of England became the mere creature of administration, and appeared ready to leap the boundaries of justice, and to undermine the pillars of their own constitution, by adhering steadfastly for several years to a complicated system of tyranny that threatened the New World with a yoke unknown to their fathers. It had ever been deemed essential to the preservation of the boasted liberties of Englishmen that no grants of money should be made by tolls, talliage, excise, or any other way, without the consent of the people by their representative voice. Innovation on a point so interesting might well be expected to create a general ferment through the American provinces. Numberless restrictions had been laid on the trade of the colonies previous to this period, and every method had been taken to check their enterprising spirit and to prevent the growth of their manufactures. Nor is it surprising that loud complaints should be made when heavy exactions were laid on the subject, who had not, and whose local situation rendered it impracticable that he should have, an equal representation in Parliament. What still heightened the resentment of the Americans in the beginning of the great contest was the reflection that they had not only always supported their own internal government with little expense to Great Britain, but while a friendly union existed, they had, on all occasions, exerted their utmost ability to comply with every constitutional requisition from the parent state. We need not here revert further back than the beginning of the reign of George III to prove this, though earlier instances might be adduced. The extraordinary exertions of the colonies in cooperation with British measures against the French in the late war were acknowledged by the British Parliament to be more than adequate to their ability. After the successful expedition to Louisbourg in 1745, the sum of £200,000 sterling was voted by the Commons as a compensation to some of the colonies for their vigorous efforts, which were carried beyond their proportional strength to aid the expedition. Not contented with the voluntary aids they had from time to time received from the colonies, and grown giddy with the luster of their own power, in the plenitude of human grandeur to which the nation had arrived in the long and successful reign of George II, such weak, impolitic, and unjust measures were pursued on the accession of his grandson, as soon threw the whole empire into the most violent convulsions. A more particular narrative of the first settlement of America, their wars with the natives, their distresses at home, their perplexities abroad, and their disputes with the parent state, relative to grants, charters, privileges, and limits may be seen in the accounts of every historical writer on the state of the colonies. Footnote: these researches have been satisfactorily made by several literary gentlemen whose talents were equal to the task. End of footnote. As this is not comprehended in the design of the present work, the reader is referred to more voluminous or more minute descriptions of the events preceding the transactions, which brought forward a revolution that emancipated the colonies from the domination of the scepter of Britain. This is a story of so much interest to the minds of every son and daughter of America, endowed with the ability of reflecting, that they will not reluctantly hasten to the detail of transactions that have awakened the attention and expectation of the millions among the nations beyond the Atlantic. End of section 2. Section 3 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 2, The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, a Congress convened at New York, 1765. The Stamp Act repealed. New grievances. Suspension of the Legislature of New York. The project of an American taxation might have been longer meditated, but the memorable era of the Stamp Act, in 1764, was the first innovation that gave a general alarm throughout the continent. By this extraordinary act, a certain duty was to be levied on all bonds, bills of lading, public papers, and writings of every kind, for the express purpose of raising a revenue to the crown. As soon as this intelligence was transmitted to America, a universal murmur succeeded, and while the judicious and penetrating thought it time to make a resolute stand against the encroachments of power, the resentment of the lower classes broke out into such excesses of riot and tumult as prevented the operation of the favorite project. Multitudes assembled in the principal towns and cities, and the popular torrent bore down all before it. The houses of some, who were the avowed abettors of the measure, and of others who were only suspected as inimical to the liberties of America, in Boston, in Newport, Connecticut, and many other places, were razed to the ground. The commissioners of the Stamp Office were everywhere compelled to renounce their employments and to enter into the most solemn engagements to make no further attempts to act in this obnoxious business. At New York, the act was printed and cried about the streets under the title of The Folly of England and the Ruin of America. In Philadelphia, the cannon were spiked up, and the bells of the city, muffled, tolled from morning to evening, and every testimony of sincere mourning was displayed on the arrival of the stamp papers, nor were any of the more southern colonies less opposed to the operation of this act, and the House of Burgess in Virginia was the first who formally resolved against the encroachments of power and the unwarrantable designs of the British Parliament. The novelty of their procedure and the boldness of spirit that marked the resolutions of that assembly at once astonished and disconcerted the officers of the Crown and the supporters of the measures of administration. These resolves were ushered into the House on the 30th of May, 1765, by Patrick Henry, Esquire, a young gentleman of the law, till then unknown in political life. Footnote: Virginia resolves. On the 29th of May, 1765, the House of Burgesses of Virginia came to the following resolutions. Whereas the Honorable House of Commons in England have of late drawn into question how far the General Assembly of this colony hath power to enact laws for laying taxes and imposing duties, payable by the people that His Majesty's most ancient colony, for settling and ascertaining the fame to all future times. The House of Burgesses of this present General Assembly have come to the several following resolutions. Resolved, that the first adventurers and settlers of this His Majesty's colony and dominion of Virginia, brought with them and transmitted to their prosperity, and all others His Majesty's subjects since inhabiting in this His Majesty's colony, all the privileges and immunities that have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. Resolved, that by the two royal charters granted by King James I, the colonists aforesaid are declared entitled to all privileges of faithful, liege, and natural-born subjects, to all intents and purposes, as if they had been abiding and born within the realm of England. Resolved, that His Majesty's liege people of this, His most ancient colony, have enjoyed the right of being thus governed by their own assembly in the article of taxes and internal police, and that the same have never been forfeited or any other way yielded up, but have been constantly recognized by the King and people of Great Britain. Resolved, therefore, that the General Assembly of the colony, together with His Majesty or his substitute, have, in their representative capacity, the only exclusive right and power to levy taxes and impositions upon the inhabitants of this colony, and that every attempt to vest such a power in any person or persons whatsoever other than the General Assembly aforesaid is illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust, and has a manifest destiny to destroy British as well as American freedom. The following resolves were not passed, though drawn up by the committee. They are inserted as a specimen of the first and early energies of the Old Dominion, as Virginia is usually called. Resolved, that His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatsoever, designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, other than the laws and ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. Resolved, that any person who shall, by speaking or writing, maintain that any person or persons other than the General Assembly of this colony have any right or power to impose or lay any taxation whatsoever on the people here, shall be deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony. End of footnote. He was a man possessed of strong powers, much professional knowledge, and of such abilities as qualified him for the exigencies of the day. Fearless of the cry of treason echoed against him from several quarters, he justified the measure and supported the resolves in a speech that did honor both to his understanding and his patriotism. The governor, to check the progress of such daring principles, immediately dissolved the assembly. But the disposition of the people was discovered when, on a new election, those gentlemen were once everywhere rechosen who had shown the most firmness and zeal in opposition to the Stamp Act. Indeed, from New Hampshire to the Carolinas, a general aversion appeared against this experiment of administration. Nor was the flame confined to the continent. It had spread to the insular regions, whose inhabitants, constitutionally more sanguine than those born in colder climates, discovered stronger marks of resentment and prouder tokens of disobedience to ministerial authority. Thus several of the West India islands shewed equal violence in the destruction of the stamp papers, disgust at the act, and indignation towards the officers who were bold enough to attempt its execution. Nor did they at this period appear less determined to resist the operation of all unconstitutional mandates than the generous planters of the southern or the independent spirits of the northern colonies. When the General Assembly of the Massachusetts met this year, it appeared that most of the members of the House of Representatives had instructions from their constituents to make every legal and spirited opposition to the distribution of the stamped papers, to the execution of the act in any form, and to every other parliamentary infringement on the rights of the people of the colonies. A specimen of the spirit of the times may be seen in a single instance of those instructions which were given to the representative of the town of Plymouth, the capital of the old colony. Footnote: on the 21st of October, the freeholders and other inhabitants of the town of Plymouth had a meeting and unanimously agreed on instructions to Thomas Foster, Esquire, their representative in the General Assembly of Massachusetts Bay, in which, after expressing the highest esteem for the British Constitution, shewing how far the people of America have exerted themselves in support thereof, and detailing their grievances, they proceed as follows. You, sir, represent a people who are not only descended from the first settlers of this country, but inhabit the very spot they first possessed. Here was first laid the foundation of the British Empire in this part of America, which from a very small beginning has increased and spread in a manner very surprising and almost incredible, especially when we consider that all this has been effected without the aid or assistance of any power on earth, that we have defended, protected, and secured ourselves against the invasions and cruelty of savages, and the subtlety and inhumanity of our inveterate and natural enemies, the French, and all this without the appropriation of any tax by stamps or stamp acts laid upon our fellow subjects in any part of the king's dominions, for defraying the expenses thereof. This place, sir, was at first the asylum of liberty, and we hope will ever be preserved sacred to it, though it was then no more than a forlorn wilderness, inhabited only by savage men and beasts. To this place our fathers, whose memories be revered, possessed of the principles of liberty in their purity, disdaining slavery, fled to enjoy those privileges which they had an undoubted right to, but were deprived of by the hands of violence and oppression in their native country. We, sir, their posterity, the freeholders and other inhabitants of this town, legally assembled for that purpose, possessed of the same sentiments, and retaining the same ardor for liberty, think it our indispensable duty on this occasion to express to you these our sentiments of the Stamp Act, and its fatal consequences to this country, and to enjoin you, as you regard not only the welfare, but the very being of this people, that you, consistent with our allegiance to the King and the relation to the government of Great Britain, disregarding all proposals for that purpose, exert all your power and influence in relation to the Stamp Act, at least until we hear the success of our petitions for relief. We likewise, to avoid disgracing the memories of our ancestors, as well as the reproaches of our own consciences, and the curses of posterity, recommended to you to obtain, if possible, in the Honorable House of Representatives of this province, a full and explicit assertion of our rights, and to have the same entered on their public records, that all generations yet to come may be convinced that we have not only a just sense of our rights and liberties, but that we never, with submission to divine providence, will be slaves to any power on earth, and as we have at all times an abhorrence of tumults and disorders, we think ourselves happy in being at present under no apprehensions of any, and in having good and wholesome laws, sufficient to preserve the peace of the province in all future times, unless provoked by some imprudent measure. So we think it by no means advisable for you to interest yourselves in the protection of stamp papers or stamp offices. The only thing we have further to recommend to you at this time is to observe on all occasions a suitable frugality and economy in the public expenses, and that you consent to no unnecessary or unusual grant at this time of distress, when the people are groaning under the burden of heavy taxes, and that you use your endeavors to inquire into and bear testimony against any past, and to prevent any future unconstitutional drafts on the public treasury. End of footnote. Similar measures were adopted in most of the other provinces, in consequence of which petitions from the respective assemblies, replete with the strongest expressions of loyalty and affection to the king, and a regard to the British nation, were presented to His Majesty through the hands of the colonial agents. The ferment was, however, too general, and the spirits of the people too much agitated to wait patiently the result of their own applications. So universal was the resentment and discontent of the people that the more judicious and discreet characters were exceedingly apprehensive that the general clamor might terminate in the extremes of anarchy. Heavy duties had been laid on all goods imported from such of the West India Islands as did not belong to Great Britain. These duties were to be paid into the exchequer, and all penalties incurred were to be recovered in the courts of Vice Admiralty by the determination of a single judge, without trial by jury, and the judge's salary was to be paid out of the fruits of the forfeiture. All remonstrances against this innovating system had hitherto been without effect, and in this period of suspense, apprehension, and anxiety, a general congress of delegates from the several provinces was proposed by the Honorable James Otis of Barnstable in the Massachusetts. He was a gentleman of great probity, experience, and parliamentary abilities, whose religious adherence to the rights of his country had distinguished him through a long course of years, in which he had sustained some of the first offices in government. This proposal from a man of his acknowledged judgment, discretion, and firmness was universally pleasing. The measure was communicated to some of the principal members of the two houses of assembly, and immediately adopted, not only by the Massachusetts, but very soon after by most of the other colonies. Thus originated the first Congress ever convened in America by the united voice of the people, in order to justify their claims to the rights of Englishmen and the privileges of the British Constitution. It has been observed that Virginia and the Massachusetts made the first opposition to parliamentary measures on different grounds. The Virginians, in their resolves, came forward, conscious of their own independence, and at once asserted their rights as men. The Massachusetts generally founded their claims on the rights of British subjects and the privileges of their British ancestors. But the era was not far distant when the United Colonies took the same ground. The claim of native independence, regardless of charters or foreign restrictions. At a period when the taste and opinions of Americans were comparatively pure and simple, while they possessed that independence and dignity of mind which is lost only by a multiplicity of wants and interests. New scenes were opening beyond the reach of human calculation. At this important crisis, the delegates appointed from several of the colonies to deliberate on the lowering aspect of political affairs met at New York on the first Tuesday of October, 1765. Footnote: several of the colonies were prevented finding delegates to the Congress at New York by the royal governors, who would not permit the assemblies to meet. End of footnote. End of section 3. Section 4 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 2, Part 2. The moderate demands of this body, and the short period of its existence, discovered at once the affectionate attachment of its members to the parent state and their dread of a general rupture, which at that time universally prevailed. Footnote: Names of the gentlemen delegated to meet at New York in 1765, on occasion of the Stamp Act, with the resolves of this first American Congress. From the province of the Massachusetts Bay, James Otis, Oliver Partridge, Timothy Ruggles, Esquires. From the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, Metcalf Bowler, Henry Ward, Esquires. From the colony of Connecticut, Eliphalet Dyer, David Rowland, William Samuel Johnson, Esquires. From the colony of New York, Robert R. Livingston, John Kruger, Philip Livingston, William Bayard, Leonard Lispenard, Esquires. From the colony of New Jersey, Robert Ogden, Hendrick Fisher, Joseph Borden, Esquires. From the province of Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, John Morton, George Bryan, Esquire. From the government of the counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex on Delaware, Caesar Rodney, Thomas McCune, Esquires. From the province of Maryland, William Murdoch, Edward Tillman, Thomas Ringgold, Esquires. From the province of South Carolina, Thomas Lynch, Christopher Gadsden, John Rutledge, Esquires. Saturday A.M., October 19th, 1765. The Congress met according to adjournment, and resumed, etc., as yesterday, and upon mature deliberation, agreed to the following declarations of the rights and grievances of the colonists in America, which were ordered to be inserted in their journals. The members of this Congress, sincerely devoted with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government, inviolably attached to the present happy establishment of the Protestant succession, and with minds deeply impressed by a sense of the present and impending misfortunes of the British colonies on this continent, having considered as maturely as time will permit the circumstances of the said colonies, esteem it in our indispensable duty to make the following declarations of our humble opinion respecting the most essential rights and liberties of the colonists, and of the grievances under which they labor, by reason of several late acts of Parliament. 1. That His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain. 2. That His Majesty's liege subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. 3. That it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. 4. That the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot, be represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain. 5. That the only representatives of the people of these colonies are people chosen by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed on them, but by their respective legislatures. 6. That all supplies to the Crown being free, gifts of the people, it is unreasonable and inconsistent with the principles and spirit of the British Constitution for the people of Great Britain to grant to His Majesty the property of the colonists. 7. That trial by jury is the inherent and invaluable right of every British subject in these colonies. 8. That the late Act of Parliament entitled An Act for Granting and Applying Certain Stamp Duties and Other Duties in the British Colonies and Plantations in America, etc., by imposing taxes on the inhabitants of these colonies, and the same Act and several other acts by extending the jurisdiction of the Courts of Admiralty beyond its ancient limits, have a manifest tendency to subvert the rights and liberties of the colonists. 9. that the duties imposed by several late acts of the British Parliament from the peculiar circumstances of these colonies will be extremely burdensome and grievous, and from the scarcity of specie, the payment of them absolutely impracticable. 10. That as the profits of the trade of these colonies ultimately center in Great Britain, to pay for the manufactures which they are obliged to take from thence, they eventually contribute very largely to all supplies granted them to the Crown. 11. That the restrictions imposed by several late acts of Parliament on the trade of these colonies will render them unable to purchase the manufactures of Great Britain. 12. That the increased prosperity and happiness of these colonies depend on the full and free enjoyment of their rights and liberties, and an intercourse with Great Britain, mutually affectionate and advantageous. 13. That it is the right of the British subjects in the colonies to petition the King, or either House of Parliament. Lastly, that it is the indispensable duty of these colonies to the best of sovereigns, to the mother country, and to themselves, to endeavor by a loyal and dutiful address to His Majesty, and humble applications to both Houses of Parliament, to procure the repeal of the Act for granting and applying certain stamp duties, of all clauses of any other Acts of Parliament, whereby the justification of the Admiralty is extended as aforesaid, and of the other late Acts for the restriction of American commerce. After these resolves, they chose Thomas Lynch, James Otis, and Thomas McKean, Esquires, to prepare a petition to the House of Commons. An address to the King and to the House of Lords was also prepared and forwarded. End of footnote. They stated their claims as subjects to the Crown of Great Britain, appointed agents to enforce them in the national councils, and agreed on petitions for the repeal of the Stamp Act, which had sown the seeds of discourse throughout the colonies. The prayer of their constituents was, in a spirited yet respectful manner, offered through them to the King, Lords, and Commons of Great Britain. They then separated to wait the event. Footnote. See their petition in the records of the Congress of New York in 1765. End of footnote. A majority of the principal merchants of the city of London, the opulent West India proprietors, who resided in England, and most of the manufacturing towns throughout the kingdom, accompanied with similar petitions, those offered by the Congress convened at New York. In consequence of the general aversion to the Stamp Act, the British ministry were changed in appearance, though the same men who had fabricated the American system still retained their influence on the mind of the King and in the councils of the nation. The parliamentary debates of the winter of 1766 evinced the important consequences expected from the decision of the question relative to the American taxation. Warm and spirited arguments in favor of the measure, energetic reasonings against it, with many sarcastic strokes on administration from some of the prime orators in Parliament, interested the hearers of every rank and description. Finally, in order to quiet the public mind, the execution of the Stamp Act was pronounced inexpedient by a majority of the House of Commons, and a bill passed for its repeal on March the 18th, 1766. But a clause was inserted therein, holding up a parliamentary right to make laws binding on the colonies in all cases whatsoever, and a kind of condition was tacked to the repeal, that compensation should be made to all who had suffered, either in person or property, by the late riotous proceedings. A short-lived joy was diffused throughout America, even by this delusive appearance of lenity. The people of every description manifested the strong-felt desire that harmony might be reestablished between Great Britain and the colonies. Bonfires, illuminations, and all the useful expressions of popular satisfaction were displayed on the joyful occasion. Yet, amidst the demonstrations of this lively gratitude, there were some who had sagacity enough to see that the British ministry was not so much instigated by principles of equity as impelled by necessity. These deemed any relaxation in Parliament an act of justice rather than favor, and felt more resentment for the manner than obligation for the design of this partial repeal. Their opinion was fully justified by the subsequent conduct of administration. When the Assembly of Massachusetts met the succeeding winter, there seemed to prevail a general disposition for peace. The sense of injury was checked, and such a spirit of affection and loyalty appeared that the two houses agreed to a bill of compensation to all sufferers in the late times of confusion and riot. But they were careful not to recognize a right in Parliament to make such a requisition. They ordered it to be entered on the journals of the House that, for the sake of internal peace, they waived all debate and controversy, though persuaded the delinquent sufferers had no just claim on the province, that, influenced by a loyal regard to His Majesty's recommendation, not considering it as a requisition, and that, from a deference to the opinions of some illustrious patrons of America in the House of Commons, who had urged them to a compliance, they therefore acceded to the proposal, though at the same time they considered it a very reprehensible step in those who had suffered to apply for relief to the Parliament of Britain, instead of submitting to the justice and clemency of their own legislature. They made several other just and severe observations on the high-toned speech of the governor, who had said that the requisition of the ministry was founded on so much justice and humanity that it could not be controverted. They inquired if the authority with which he introduced the ministerial demand precluded all disputation about complying with it, what freedom of choice they had left in the case. They said, with regard to the rest of your Excellency's speech, we are constrained to observe that the general air and style of it favors much more of an act of free grace and pardon than of a parliamentary address to the two houses of assembly, and we most sincerely, with your Excellency, have been pleased to reserve it, if needful, for a proclamation. In the bill for compensation by the Assembly of Massachusetts was added a very offensive clause. A general pardon and oblivion was granted to all offenders in the late confusion, tumults, and riots. An exact detail of these proceedings was transmitted to England. The King and Council disallowed the act, as comprising in it a bill of indemnity to the Boston rioters, and ordered compensation made to the late sufferers, without any supplementary conditions. No notice was taken of this order, nor any alteration made in the act. The money was drawn from the treasury of the province to satisfy the claimants for compensation, and no farther inquiries were made relative to the authors of the late tumultuary proceedings of the time, when the minds of men had been brought up to a ferment beyond the reach of all legal restraint. The year 1766 had passed over without any other remarkable political events. All colonial measures agitated in England were regularly transmitted by the minister for the American department to the several plantation governors, who, on every communication, endeavored to enforce the operation of parliamentary authority by the most sanguine injunctions of their own, and a magnificent display of royal resentment on the smallest token of disobedience to ministerial requisitions. But it will appear that through a long series of resolves and messages, letters and petitions, which passed between the parties, previous to the commencement of hostilities, the watchful guardians of American freedom never lost sight of the intrigues of their enemies, or the mischievous designs of such as were under the influence of the crown on either side the Atlantic. It may be observed that the tranquillity of the provinces had for some time been interrupted by the innovating spirit of the British ministry, instigated by a few prostitutes of power, nurtured in the lap of America, and bound by every tie of honor and gratitude to be faithful to the interest of their country. The social enjoyments of life had long been disturbed. The mind fretted, and the people rendered suspicious when they saw some of their fellow citizens who did not hesitate at a junction with the accumulated swarms of hirelings sent from Great Britain to ravish from the colonies the rights they claimed both by nature and by compact, that the hard-hearted judges of admiralty and the crowd of revenue officers that hovered about the custom houses should seldom be actuated by the principles of justice is not strange. Peculation was generally the prime object of this class, and the oaths they administered and the habits they encouraged were favorable to every species of bribery and corruption. The rapacity which instigated these descriptions of men had little check, while they saw themselves upheld even by some governors of provinces. In this grade, which ought ever to be the protectors of the rights of the people, there were some who were total strangers to all ideas of equity, freedom, or urbanity. It was observed at this time in a speech before the House of Commons by Colonel Barry that, to his certain knowledge, some were promoted to the highest feats of honor in America, who were glad to fly to a foreign country to escape being brought to the bar of justice in their own. However injudicious the appointments to American departments might be, the darling point of an American revenue was an object too consequential to be relinquished, either by the court at St. James, the plantation governors, or their mercenary adherents dispersed through the continent. Besides these, there were several classes in America who were at first exceedingly opposed to measures that militated with the designs of administration. Some, impressed by long connection, were intimidated by her power and attached by affection to Britain. Others, the true disciples of passive obedience, had real scruples of conscience with regard to any resistance to the powers that be. These, whether actuated by affection or fear, by principle or interest, formed a close combination with the colonial governors, custom house officers, and all insubordinate departments, who hung on the court for subsistence. By the tenor of the writings of some of these, and the insolent behavior of others, they became equally obnoxious in the eyes of the people, with the officers of the crown and the danglers for place, who, disappointed by their prey by the repeal of the Stamp Act, and restless for some new project that might enable them to rise into importance on the spoils of America, were continually whispering malicious insinuations into the ears of the financiers and ministers of colonial departments. They represented the mercantile body in America as a set of smugglers, forever breaking over the laws of trade and of society. The people in general, as factious, turbulent, and aiming at independence. The legislatures in the several provinces as marked with the same spirit, and government everywhere in so lax a state that the civil authority was insufficient to prevent the fatal effects of popular discontent. It is indeed true that resentment had in several instances arisen to outrage, and that the most unwarrantable excesses had been committed on some occasions, which gave grounds for unfavorable representations. Yet it must be acknowledged that the voice of the people seldom breathes universal murmur, but when the insolence or the oppression of their rulers extorts the bitter complaint. On the contrary, there is a certain supineness which generally overspreads the multitude, and disposes mankind to submit quietly to any form of government, rather than to be at the expense and hazard of resistance. They become attached to ancient modes by habits of obedience, though the reins of authority are sometimes held by the most rigorous hand. Thus we have seen in all ages, the many become the slaves of the few. Preferring the wretched tranquillity of inglorious ease, they patiently yield to despotic masters, until awakened by multiplied wrongs to the feelings of human nature, which, when once aroused to a consciousness of the native freedom and equal rights of man, ever revolts at the idea of servitude. Perhaps the story of political revolution never exhibited a more general enthusiasm in the cause of liberty than that which for several years pervaded all ranks in America, and brought forward events little expected by the most sanguine spirits in the beginning of the controversy. A contest now pushed with so much vigor that the intelligent yeomanry of the country, as well as those educated in the higher walks, became convinced that nothing less than a systematical plan of slavery was designed against them. They viewed the chains as already forged to manacle the unborn millions, and though everyone seemed to dread any new interruption of public tranquility, the impetuosity of some led them into excesses which could not be restrained by those of more cool and discreet deportment. To the most moderate and judicious, it soon became apparent that unless a timely and bold resistance prevented, the colonists must, in a few years, sink into the same wretched thraldom that marks the miserable Asiatic. End of section 4. Section 5 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 2, Conclusion. Few of the executive offices employed by the King of Great Britain, and fewer of their adherents, were qualified either by education, principle, or inclination to allay the ferment of the times, or to eradicate the suspicions of men who, from an hereditary love of freedom, were tenderly touched by the smallest attempt to undermine the invaluable possession. Yet perhaps few of the colonies at this period suffered equal embarrassments with the Massachusetts. The inhabitants of that province were considered as the prime leaders of faction, the disturbers of public tranquility, and Boston the seat of sedition. Vengeance was continually denounced against that capital, and indeed the whole province, through the letters, messages, and speeches of their first magistrate. Unhappily for both parties, Governor Bernard was very illy calculated to promote the interest of the people or support the honor of his master. He was a man of little genius, but some learning. He was by education strongly impressed with ideas of canon and feudal law, and fond of a system of government that had long been obsolete in England and had never had an existence in America. His disposition was choleric and sanguine, obstinate and designing, yet too open and frank to disguise his intrigues, and too precipitant to bring them to maturity. A revision of colony charters, a resumption of former privileges, and an American revenue were the constant topics of his letters to administration. Footnote: see his pamphlet on law and polity, and his letters to the British ministry while he resided in the Massachusetts. End of footnote. To prove the necessity of these measures, the most trivial disturbance was magnified to a riot, and to give a pretext to these wicked insinuations, it was thought by many that tumults were frequently excited by the indiscretion or malignancy of his own partisans. The declaratory bill still hung suspended over the heads of the Americans, nor was it suffered to remain long without trying its operative effects. The clause holding up a right to tax America at pleasure, and to bind them in all cases whatsoever, was comprehensive and alarming, yet it was not generally expected that the ministry would soon endeavor to avail themselves of the dangerous experiment, but in this the public were mistaken. It has already been observed that the arbitrary disposition of George III, the absurd system of policy adopted in conformity to his principles, and a parliamentary majority at the command of the ministry, rendered it not difficult to enforce any measures that might tend to an accession to the powers of the crown. It was a just sentiment of an elegant writer that almost all the vices of royalty have been principally occasioned by a slavish adulation in the language of their subjects, and to the shame of the English it must be said that none of the enslaved nations in the world have addressed the throne in a more fulsome and hyperbolic style. The dignity of the crown, the supremacy of Parliament, and the disloyalty of the colonies were the theme of the court, the echo of its creatures, and of the British nation in general. Nor was it thought good policy to let the high claims of government lie long in a dormant state. Accordingly, not many months after the repeal of the Stamp Act, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, Esquire, came forward and pawned his character on the success of a new attempt to tax the American colonies. He was a gentleman of conspicuous abilities and much professional knowledge, endowed with more boldness than discretion. He had the talent of bringing together at once all that was necessary to establish, to illustrate, and to decorate the side of the question he was on. Footnote. A writer has more recently observed that Charles Townshend was a man of rising parliamentary reputation and brilliant talents, but capricious, insincere, intriguing, and wholly destitute of discretion or solidity. Belgium, on the reign of George III. End of footnote. He introduced several bills in support of his sanguinary designs, which, without much difficulty, obtained the sanction of Parliament and the royal assent. The purport of the new project for revenue was to levy certain duties on paper, glass, painter's colors, and several other articles usually imported into America. It was also directed that the duties on India teas, which had been a productive source of revenue in England, should be taken off there, and 3 pence per pound levied on all kinds that should in future be purchased in the colonies. This inconsiderable duty on teas finally became an object of high importance and altercation. It was not the sum, but the principle that was contested. It manifestly appeared that this was only a financiering expedient to raise a revenue from the colonies by imperceptible taxes. The defenders of the privileges and the freedom of the colonies denied all parliamentary right to tax them in any way whatever. They asserted that if the collection of this duty was permitted, it would establish a precedent and strengthen the claim Parliament had assumed to tax them at pleasure. To do it by the secret modes of imposts and excises would ruin their trade, corrupt the morals of the people, and was more abhorrent in their eyes than a direct demand. The most judicious and intelligent Americans at this time considered all imperceptible taxes fraught with evils that tended to enslave any country plunged in the boundless chaos of fiscal demands that this practice introduces. In consequence of the new system, a board of customs was instituted, and commissioners appointed to set in Boston to collect the duties, which were, besides other purposes, to supply a fund for the payment of the large salaries annexed to their office. A civil lift was soon after established, and the governors of the Massachusetts, judges of the Superior Court, and such other officers as had heretofore depended on the free grants of the representative body were to be paid out of the revenue chest. Thus rendered wholly independent of the General Assembly, there was no check left on the wanton exercise of power in the Crown officers, however disposed they might be to abuse their trust. The distance from the throne, it was said, must delay, if not wholly prevent, all relief under any oppressions the people might suffer from the servants of government, and to crown the long list of grievances specified by the patriots of the day, the extension of the courts of vice-admiralty was none of the least. They were vested with certain powers that dispensed with the mode of trial by jury, annihilated the privileges of Englishmen, and placed the liberty of every man in the hand of a petty officer of the customs. By warrant of a writ of assistance from the governor or lieutenant governor, any officer of the revenue was authorized to enter the dwelling of the most respectable inhabitant on the smallest suspicion of a concealment of contraband goods, and to insult, search, or seize with impunity. An attorney at law, of some professional abilities and ingenuity, but without either property or principle, was, by the instigation of Mr. Bernard, appointed sole judge of admiralty in the Massachusetts. Footnote: Jonathan Sewell, a native of the province, whose pen had been employed to vindicate the measures of administration and the conduct of Governor Bernard, under the signature of Philalethes, Massachusetts, etc., etc. End of footnote. The dangerous aspect of this court, particularly when aided by writs of assistance, was opposed with peculiar energy and strength of government by James Otis, Esquire, of Boston, who, by the exertion of his talents and the sacrifice of interest, may justly claim the honor of laying the foundation of a revolution which has been productive of the happiest effects to the civil and political interests of mankind. He was the first champion of American freedom who had the courage to put his signature to the contest between Great Britain and the colonies. He had, in a clear, concise, and nervous manner, stated and vindicated the rights of the American colonies, and published his observations in Boston, while the Stamp Act hung suspended. This tract was written with such a spirit of liberality, loyalty, and impartiality that though at the time some were ready to pronounce it treasonable, yet, when opposition ran higher, many of the most judicious partisans of the crown were willing to admit it as a just criterion of political truth. But the author was abused and vilified by the scribblers of the court, and threatened with an arrest from the crown for the boldness of his opinions. Yet he continued to advocate the rights of the people, and in the course of his argument against the iniquitous consequences of writs of assistance, he observed that his engaging in this cause had raised the resentment of its abettors, but that he argued it from principle and with peculiar pleasure, as it was in the favor of British liberty, and in opposition to the exercise of a power that in former periods of English history had cost one king of England his head, and another his crown. He added, "I can sincerely declare that I submit myself to every opprobrious name for conscience sake, and despise all those whom guilt, folly, or malice have made my foes." It was on this occasion that Mr. Otis resigned the office of Judge Advocate and renounced all employment under so corrupt an administration, boldly declaring in the face of the Supreme Court, at this dangerous crisis, that the only principle of public conduct, worthy a gentleman or a man, was the sacrifice of health, ease, applause, estate, or even life, to the sacred cause of his country. That these manly sentiments in private life made the good citizen, in public, the patriot and the hero. Thus was verified in his conduct the observation of a writer of merit and celebrity, that it was as difficult for Great Britain to frighten as to cheat Americans into servitude, that she ought to leave them in the peaceable possession of that liberty which they received at their birth, and were resolved to retain to their death. Footnote: Mr. Dickinson, author of the much admired Farmer's Letters, the first copy of which he enclosed to his friend Mr. Otis, and observed to him that the examples of public spirit in the cold regions of the North had roused the languid latitudes of the South to a proper vindication of their rights. Copy from Mr. Dickinson's original letter to Mr. Otis, accompanying the celebrated Farmer's Letters. Philadelphia, December 5th, 1767. Dear Sir, the liberties of our common country appear to me to be at this moment exposed to the most imminent danger, and this apprehension has engaged me to lay any sentiments before the public in letters, of which I send you a copy. Only one has yet been published, and what their effect may be cannot yet be known. But whenever the cause of American freedom is to be vindicated, I look towards the province of Massachusetts Bay. she must, as she has hitherto done, first kindle the sacred flame that on such occasions must warm and illuminate this continent. Words are wanting to express my sense of the vigilance, perseverance, spirit, prudence, resolution, and firmness with which your colony has distinguished herself in our unhappy times. May God ever grant her noble labors the same successful issue which was obtained by the repeal of the Stamp Act. In my gratitude to your province in general, I do not forget the obligations which all Americans are under, to you in particular, for the indefatigable zeal and undaunted courage you have shown in defending their rights. My opinion of your love for your country induces me to commit to your hands the enclosed letters, to be disposed of as you think proper, not intending to give out any other copy. I have shown them to 3 men of learning here, who are my friends. They think with me that the most destructive consequences must follow if these colonies do not instantly, vigorously, and unanimously unite themselves in the same manner they did against the Stamp Act. Perhaps they and I are mistaken. I therefore send the piece containing the reasons for this opinion to you, who I know can determine its true worth. And if you can discover no other merit in it, permit me at least to claim the merit of having wrote it with the most ardent affection for the British colonies, the purest intentions to promote their welfare, an honest desire to effect their rights, and with a deep sense of their impending misfortunes. Our cause is a cause of the highest dignity. It is nothing less than to maintain the liberty with which heaven itself hath made us free. I hope it will not be disgraced in any colony by a single rash step. We have constitutional methods of seeking redress, and they are the best methods. This subject leads me to inform you with pleasure, because I think it must give you pleasure, that the moderation of your conduct in composing the minds of your fellow citizens has done you the highest credit with us. You may be assured I feel a great satisfaction in hearing your praises. For everything that advances your reputation or interest will always afford sincere joy to, dear sir, your most affectionate and most humble servant, John Dickinson, Honorable James Otis, Jr., Esquire. End of footnote. When the new parliamentary regulations reached America, all the colonies in their several departments petitioned in the most strenuous manner against any American taxation and all other recent innovations relative to the government of the British provinces. These petitions were, when received by the ministry, treated by them with the utmost contempt, but they were supported by a respectable party in the Parliament of Britain, which did not neglect to warn the administration of the danger of precipitating measures that might require, before the termination of a contest thus hurried on, more virtue and abilities than the ministry possessed. By some steps taken by administration previous to the present period, there was reason to suppose that they were themselves apprehensive that their system for governing the colonies in a more arbitrary manner would give great offense and create disturbances of so alarming a nature that perhaps the aid of military power might become necessary to enforce the completion of their designs. Doubtless it was with the view of facilitating the new projects that an extraordinary bill had been passed in Parliament, making it lawful for the officers of the British Army to quarter their troops in private houses throughout the colonies. Thus, while mixed in every family, it might become more easy to awe the people into submission and compel them by military terrors to the basest compliances. But the colony agents residing in London and the merchants concerned in the American trade remonstrated so warmly against the injustice and cruelty of such a procedure that a part of the bill was dropped. Yet it was too important a point wholly to relinquish. Of consequence, a clause was left, obliging the several legislative assemblies to provide quarters for the king's marching regiments, and to furnish a number of specified articles at the expense of the colonies, wherever they might be stationed. This act continued in full force after the Stamp Act was repealed, though it equally militated with that part of the British Constitution which provides that no moneys should be raised on the subject without his consent. Yet rather than enter on a new dispute, the colonists in general chose to evade it for the present, and without many observations thereon, had occasionally made some voluntary provisions for the support of the king's troops. It was hoped the act might be only a temporary expedient to hold up the authority of Parliament, and that in a short time the claim might die of itself, without any attempt to revive such an unreasonable demand. But New York, more explicit in her refusal to obey, was suspended from all powers of legislation until the Quartering Act should be complied with in the fullest extent. By this unprecedented treatment of one of the colonies, and the innumerable exactions and restrictions on all, a general apprehension prevailed that nothing but a firm, vigorous, and united resistance could shield from the attacks that threatened the total extinction of civil liberty through the continent. End of section 5. Section 6 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 3, Massachusetts. Cursory Observations. Massachusetts Circular Letter. A new House of Representatives called. Governor Bernard impeached. A riot on the seizure of a vessel. Troops applied for to protect the king's officers. A convention at Boston. Troops arrive. A combination against all commerce with Great Britain. A General Assembly convened at Boston. Removed to Cambridge. Governor Bernard, after his impeachment, repairs to England. The British colonies at this period through the American continent contained, exclusive of Canada and Nova Scotia, the provinces of New Hampshire and Massachusetts Bay, of Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the Delaware counties, Virginia, Maryland, the two Carolinas, and Georgia, besides the Floridas, and in unbounded tract of wilderness not yet explored. These several provinces had been always governed by their own distinct legislatures. It is true there was some variety in their religious opinions, but a striking similarity in their political institutions, except in the proprietary governments. At the same time, the colonies, afterwards the 13 states, were equally marked with that manly spirit of freedom, characteristic of Americans from New Hampshire to Georgia. Aroused by the same injuries from the parent state, threatened in the same manner by the common enemies to the rights of society among themselves, their petitions to the throne had been suppressed without even a reading. Their remonstrances were ridiculed and their supplications rejected. They determined no longer to submit. All stood ready to unite in the same measures to obtain that redress of grievances they had so long requested, and that relief from burdens that had so long complained of, to so little purpose. Yet there was no bond of connection by which a similarity of sentiment and concord in action might appear, whether they were again disposed to revert to the hitherto fruitless mode of petition and remonstrance, or to leave that humiliating path for a line of conduct more cogent and influential in the contests of nations. A circular letter dated February the 11th, 1768, by the legislature of Massachusetts, directed to the representatives and burgesses of the people through the continent, was a measure well calculated for this salutary purpose. Footnote: This measure had been contemplated by several gentlemen a year or two before it took place, among others by the learned and excellent Dr. Jonathan Mayhew of Boston. See the annexed letter written by him soon after the repeal of the Stamp Act. The abilities, virtues, and patriotism of Dr. Mayhew were so distinguished that the following fragment may be pleasing and particularly impressive, as it was the last letter he ever wrote to anyone, and within 3 days after its date, this great and good man closed his eyes on the politics and vanities of human life. Lord's Day morning, June 8, 1766. Honorable James Otis, Jr., Esquire. To a good man, all time is holy enough, and none too holy to do good or to think upon it. Cultivating a good understanding and hearty friendship between these colonies and their several houses of assembly appears to me to be so necessary a part of prudence and good policy, all things considered, that no favorable opportunity for that purpose ought to be omitted. I think such as one now presents. Would it not be very proper and decorous for our assembly to send circular congratulatory letters to all the rest, without exception, on the repeal and the present favorable aspect of things? Letters conceived at once in terms of warm friendship and regard to them, of loyalty to the king, of filial affection towards the mother country, and intimating a desire to cement and perpetuate union among ourselves by all practical and laudable methods. A good foundation is already laid for this latter by the late Congress, which in my poor opinion was a wise measure, and actually contributed not a little towards our obtaining a redress of grievances, however some may affect to disparage it. Pursuing this track, and never losing sight of it, may be of the utmost importance to the colonies, on some future occasions, perhaps the only means of perpetuating their liberties, for what may be hereafter we cannot tell, how favorable soever present appearances may be. It is not safe for the colonies to sleep, since they will probably always have some wakeful enemies in Britain, and if they should be such children as to do so, I hope there are at least some persons too much of men, and friends to them, to rock the cradle or sing lullaby to them. You have heard of the communion of churches, and I am very early tomorrow morning to set out for Rutland, to assist at an ecclesiastical council, not expecting to return this week while I was thinking of this in my bed with the dawn of day. The great use and importance of a communion of colonies appeared to me in a very strong light, which determined me immediately to set down these hints in order to transmit them to you, not knowing that the House may be prorogued or dissolved before my return, or having an opportunity to speak to you, you will make such a use of them as you think proper, or none at all. I have had a sight of the answer to the last very extraordinary speech, with which I was much pleased. Footnote: Speech of Governor Bernard. End of footnote. It appears to me solid and judicious, and though spirited, not more so than the case absolutely required, unless we could be content to have an absolute and uncontrollable instead of a limited constitutional governor. I cannot think the man will have one wife in good, much less one truly great man at home, to stand by him in so open and flagrant attack upon our charter rights and privileges. But the less asperity in language the better, provided there is firmness in adhering to our rights, and opposition to all encroachment. I am, sir, your most obedient humble servant, Jonathan Mayhew. End of footnote. This letter painted in the strongest colors the difficulties they apprehended, the embarrassments they felt, and the steps already taken to obtain relief. It contained the full opinion of that assembly relative to the late acts of Parliament, while at the same time they expatiated on their duty and attachment to the king, and detailed in terms of respect and representations that had been made to his ministers. They expressed the boldest determination to continue a free but a loyal people. Indeed, there were few, if any, who indulged an idea of a final separation from Britain at so early a period, or that even wished for more than an equal participation of the privileges of the British Constitution. Independence was a plant of a later growth, though the soil might be congenial, and the boundaries of nature pointed out the event. Yet everyone chose to view it at a distance, rather than wish to witness the convulsions that such a dismemberment of the empire must necessarily occasion. After the circulation of this alarming letter, wherever any of the governors had permitted the legislative bodies to meet, an answer was returned by the assemblies replete with the encomiums on the exertion and the zeal of the Massachusetts. Footnote. Copy of the circular letter, which was sent from the House of Representatives of the province of Massachusetts Bay to the speakers of the respective Houses of Representatives and Burgesses on the continent of North America. Province of Massachusetts Bay, February 11, 1768. The House of Representatives of this province have taken into their serious consideration the great difficulties that must accrue to themselves and their constituents by the operation of the several acts of Parliament imposing duties and taxes on the American colonies. As it is a subject in which every colony is deeply interested, they have no reason to doubt but your House is duly impressed with its importance, and that such constitutional measures will become into as are proper. It seems to be necessary that all possible care should be taken that the representations of the several assemblies, upon so delicate a point, should harmonize with each other. The House therefore hope that this letter will be candidly considered in no other light than as expressing a disposition freely to communicate their mind to a sister colony upon a common concern, in the same manner as they would be glad to receive the sentiments of your or any other house of assembly on the continent. The House have humbly represented to the ministry their own sentiments, that His Majesty's High Court of Parliament in the supreme legislative power over the whole empire, that in all free states the Constitution is fixed, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution, it cannot overlap the bounds of it without destroying its foundation, that the Constitution ascertains and limits both sovereignty and allegiance, and therefore His Majesty's American subjects, who acknowledge themselves bound by the ties of allegiance, have an equitable claim to the full enjoyment of the fundamental rules of the British Constitution, that it is an essential, unalterable right in the nature engrafted into the British Constitution as a fundamental law, and ever held sacred and irrevocable by the subjects within the realm, that what a man hath honestly acquired is absolutely his own, which he may freely give, but cannot be taken from him without his consent, that the American subjects may therefore, exclusive of any consideration of charter rights, with a decent firmness adapted to the character of freemen and subjects, assert this natural constitutional right. It is moreover their humble opinion, which they express with the greatest deference to the wisdom of the Parliament, that the acts made there, imposing duties on the people of this province for the sole and express purpose of raising a revenue, are infringements of their natural and constitutional rights, because as they are not represented in the British Parliament, His Majesty's Commons in Britain, by those acts grant their property without their consent. The House further are of opinion that their constituents, considering their local circumstances, cannot by any possibility be represented in the Parliament, and that it will forever be impracticable that they should be equally represented there, and consequently not at all, being separated by an ocean of 1,000 leagues. that His Majesty's royal predecessors, for this reason, were graciously pleased to form a subordinate legislature here, that their subjects might enjoy the inalienable rights of a representation. Also, that considering the utter impracticability of their ever being fully and equally represented in Parliament, and the great expense that must unavoidably attend even a partial representation there, this House think that a taxation of their constituents, even without their consent, grievous as it is, would be preferable to any representation that could be admitted for them there. Upon these principles, and also considering that were the right in the Parliament ever so clear, yet for obvious reasons it would be beyond the rule of equity that their constituents should be taxed on the manufactures of Great Britain here, in addition to the duties they pay for them in England, and other advantages arising to Great Britain from the acts of trade, this House have referred a humble, dutiful, and loyal petition to our most gracious sovereign, and made such representations to His Majesty's ministries as they apprehend would tend to obtain redress. They have also submitted to consideration whether any people can be said to enjoy any degree of freedom if the Crown, in addition to its undoubted authority of constituting a governor, should appoint him such a stipend as it should judge proper, without the consent of the people and at their expense, and whether while the judges of the land and other civil officers hold not their commissions during good behavior, their having salaries appointed for them by the Crown, independent of the people, hath not a tendency to subvert the principles of equity, and endanger the happiness and security of the subject. In addition to these measures, the House have wrote a letter to their agent, Mr. de Burt, the sentiments of which he is directed to lay before the ministry, wherein they take notice of the hardship of the act for preventing mutiny and desertion, which requires the governor and council to provide enumerated articles for the king's marching troops, and the people to pay the expense, and also the commission of the gentlemen appointed commissioners of the customs to reside in America, which authorizes them to make as many appointments as they think fit, and to pay the appointees what sums they please. For whole malconduct they are not accountable, from whence it may happen that offices of the Crown may be multiplied to such a degree as to become dangerous to the liberty of the people, by virtue of a commission which does not appear to this House to derive any such advantages to trade as may have been led to expect. These are the sentiments and proceedings of this House, and as they have too much reason to believe that the enemies of the colonies have represented them to His Majesty's ministers and the Parliament as factious, disloyal, and having a disposition to make themselves independent of the mother country, they have taken occasion in the most humble terms to assure His Majesty and his ministers that with regard to the people of this province, and as they doubt not all the colonies, that the charge is unjust. The House is fully satisfied that your assembly is too generous and enlarged in sentiment to believe that this letter proceeds from an ambition of taking the lead, or dictating to the other assemblies. They freely submit their opinion to the judgment of others, and shall take it kind in your House to point out to them anything further that may be thought necessary. This House cannot conclude without expressing their firm confidence in the King, our common head and father, that the united and dutiful supplications of his distressed American subjects will meet with his royal and favorable acceptance. Signed by the Speaker. A copy of the above letter was also, by order of the House, sent to Dennis D. de Burt, Esquire, agent of the province in London, that he might make use of it, if necessary, to prevent any misrepresentations in England. End of footnote. They observed that the spirit that dictated that letter was but a transcript of their own feelings, and that though equally impressed with every sentiment of respect to the Prince on the throne of Britain, and feeling the strongest attachment to the House of Hanover, they could not but reject with disdain the late measures, so repugnant to the dignity of the crown and the true interest of the realm, and that at every hazard they were determined to resist all acts of Parliament for the injurious purpose of raising a revenue in America. They also added that they had respectively offered the most humble supplications to the king, that they had remonstrated to both houses of Parliament, and had directed their agents at the British court to leave no effort untried to obtain relief, without being compelled to what might be deemed by royalty an illegal mode of opposition. In consequence of the spirited proceedings of the House of Representatives, the General Assembly of Massachusetts was dissolved, nor were they suffered to meet again until a new election. These transactions were carefully transmitted to administration by several of the plantation governors, and particularly Mr. Bernard, with inflammatory observations of his own, interlarded with the most illiberal abuse of the principal leaders of the late measures in the Assembly of Massachusetts. End of section 6. Section 7 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 3, Part 2. Their charter, which still provided for the election of the legislature, obliged the governor to summon a new assembly to meet May the 24th, 1768. The first communication laid before the House by the governor contained a haughty requisition from the British Minister of State, directing in His Majesty's name that the present House should immediately rescind the resolutions of a former one, which had produced the celebrated circular letter. Governor Bernard also intimated that it was His Majesty's pleasure that on a non-compliance with this extraordinary mandate, the present assembly should be dissolved without delay. What heightened the resentment to the manner of this singular order, signed by Lord Hilborough, Secretary of State for the American Department, was that he therein intimated to the governor that he need not fear the most unqualified obedience on his part to the high measures of administration, assuring him that it would not operate to his disadvantage, as care would be taken in future to provide for his interest and to support the dignity of government, without the interpositions or existence of a provincial legislature. These messages were received by the representative body with a steadiness and resolution becoming the defenders of the rights of a free people. After appointing a committee to consider and prepare an answer to them, they proceeded with great coolness to the usual business of the session, without further notice of what had passed. Within a day or two, they received a second message from the governor, purporting that he had expected an immediate and an explicit answer to the authoritative requisition, and that if they longer postponed their resolutions, he should consider their delay as an oppugnation to His Majesty's authority, and a negative to the command by an expiring faction. On this, the House desired time to consult their constituents on such an extraordinary question. This being peremptorily and petulantly refused, the House ordered the Board of Council to be informed that they were entering on a debate of importance, that they should give them notice when it was over, and directed the doorkeeper to call no member out on any pretense whatsoever. The committee appointed to answer the governor's several messages were gentlemen of known attachment to the cause of their country, who on every occasion had rejected all servile compliances with ministerial requisitions. They were not long on the business. When they returned to the house, the galleries were immediately cleared, and they reported an answer, bold and determined, yet decent and loyal. In the course of their reply, they observed that it was not an expiring faction that the governor had charged with oppugnation to His Majesty's authority, that it was the best blood of the colony who opposed the ministerial measures, men of reputation, fortune, and rank, equal to any who enjoyed the smiles of government, that their exertions were from a conscious sense of duty to their God, to their king, to their country, and to posterity. Footnote: the principal members of this committee were Major Joseph Hawley of Northampton, James Otis, Esquire, of Boston, Samuel Adams, James Warren of Plymouth, John Hancock, and Thomas Cushing, Esquires. End of footnote. This committee at the same time reported a very spirited letter to Lord Hilborough, which they had prepared to lay before the House. In this they remonstrated on the injustice as well as absurdity of a requisition when a compliance was impracticable, even had they the inclination to rescind the doings of a former House. This letter was approved by the House, and on a division on the question of rescinding the vote of a former Assembly, it was negatived by a majority of 92 to 17. The same committee was immediately nominated to prepare a petition to the King to remove Mr. Barnard from the government of Massachusetts. They drew up a petition for this purpose without leaving the House, and immediately reported it. They alleged a long list of accusations against the governor, and requested His Majesty that one more worthy to represent so great and good a king might be sent to preside in the province. Thus impeached by the House, the same minority that had appeared ready to rescind the circular letter declared themselves against the impeachment of Governor Barnard. Their servility was marked with a peculiar odium. They were stigmatized by the appellation of the infamous 17, until their names were lost in a succession of great events and more important characters. When the doors of the House were opened, the secretary, who had been long in waiting for admission, informed the House that the governor was in the chair, and desired their attendance in the council chamber. They complied without hesitation, but were received in a most ungracious manner. With much ill humor, the governor reprimanded them in the language of an angry pedagogue, instead of the manner becoming the first magistrate when addressing the representatives of a free people. He concluded his harangue by proroguing the assembly, which within a few days he dissolved by proclamation. In the meantime, by warm and virulent letters from this indiscreet governor, by others full of invective from the commissioners of the customs, and by the secret influence of some, who yet concealed themselves within the visage of moderation, who held the language of patriotism, but trod in the footsteps of tyranny. Leave was obtained from administration to apply to the commander-in-chief of the king's troops, then at New York, to send several regiments to Boston as a necessary aid to civil government, which they represented as too weak to suppress the disorders of the times. It was urged that this step was absolutely necessary to enable the officers of the Crown to carry into execution the laws of the Supreme Legislature. A new pretext had been recently given to the malignant party to urge with a shew of plausibility the immediate necessity of the military arm to quell the riotous proceedings of the town of Boston, to strengthen the hands of government, and restore order and tranquillity to the province. The seizure of a vessel belonging to a popular gentleman, under suspicion of a breach of the Acts of Trade, raised a sudden resentment among the citizens of Boston. Footnote: John Hancock, Esquire, afterwards governor of Massachusetts. End of footnote. The conduct of the owner was indeed reprehensible, in permitting a part of the cargo to be unladen in a clandestine manner, but the mode of the seizure appeared like a design to raise a sudden ferment that might be improved to corroborate the arguments for the necessity of standing troops to be stationed within the town. On a certain signal, A number of boats, manned and armed, rowed up to the wharf, cut the fasts of the suspected vessel, carried her off, and placed her under the stern of a ship of war, as if apprehensive of a rescue. This was executed in the edge of the evening, when apprentices and the younger classes were usually in the streets. It had what was thought to be the desired effect. The inconsiderate rabble, unapprehensive of the snare, and thoughtless of consequences, pelted some of the custom-house officers with brickbats, broke their windows, drew one of their boats before the door of the gentleman they thought injured, and set it on fire, after which they dispersed without further mischief. This trivial disturbance was exaggerated until it wore the complexion of a riot of the first magnitude. By the insinuations of the party and their malignant conduct, it was not strange that in England it was considered as a London mob, collected in the streets of Boston, with some formidable desperado at their head. After this fracas, the custom-house officers repaired immediately to Castle William, as did the Board of Commissioners. This fortress was about a league from the town. From thence they expressed their apprehensions of personal danger, in strong language. Fresh applications were made to General Gage to hasten on his forces from New York, assuring him that the lives of the officers of the Crown were insecure, unless placed beyond the reach of popular resentment by an immediate military aid. In consequence of these representations, several detachments from Halifax and 2 regiments lately from Ireland were directed to repair to Boston with all possible dispatch. End of section 7. Section 8 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 3, Part 3. The experience of all ages and the observations both of the historian and the philosopher agree that a standing army is the most ready engine in the hand of despotism to debase the powers of the human mind and eradicate the manly spirit of freedom. The people have certainly everything to fear from a government when the springs of its authority are fortified only by a standing military force. Wherever an army is established, it introduces a revolution in manners, corrupts the morals, propagates every species of vice, and degrades the human character. Threatened with the immediate introduction of this dread calamity, deprived by the dissolution of their legislature of all power to make any legal opposition, neglected by their sovereign, and insulted by the governor he had set over them, much the largest part of the community was convinced that they had no resource but in the strength of their virtues, the energy of their resolutions, and the justice of their cause. In this state of general apprehension, confusion, and suspense, the inhabitants of Boston again requested Governor Bernard to convoke an assembly, and suffer the representatives of the whole people to consult and advise as to this critical conjuncture. He rejected this application with an air of insult, and no time was to be lost. Letters were instantly forwarded from the capital, requesting a delegation of suitable persons to meet in convention from every town in the province before the arrival of the troops, and if possible, to take some steps to prevent the fatal effects of these dangerous and unprecedented measures. The whole country felt themselves interested and readily complied with the proposal. The most respectable persons from 196 towns were chosen delegates to assemble at Boston on the 22nd of September. They accordingly met at that time and place. As soon as they were convened, the governor sent them an angry message, admonishing them immediately to disperse, assuring them The king was determined to maintain his entire sovereignty over the province, that their present meeting might be in consequence of their ignorance, but that if after this admonition they continued their usurpation, they might repent their temerity, as he was determined to assert the authority of the crown in a more public manner, if they continued to disregard this authoritative warning. He, however, found he had not men to deal with, either ignorant of law, regardless of its sanctions, or terrified by the frowns of power. The convention made him a spirited but decent answer, containing the reasons of their assembling, and the line of conduct they were determined to pursue in spite of every menace. The governor refused to receive their reply. He urged the illegality of the assembly, and made use of every subterfuge to interrupt their proceedings. Their situation was indeed truly delicate, as well as dangerous. The convention was a body not known in the constitution of their government, and in the strict sense of law, it might be styled a treasonable meeting. They still professed fealty to the crown of Britain, and though the principle had been shaken by injuries that might have justified a more sudden renunciation of loyalty, yet theirs was cherished by a degree of religious scruple, amidst every species of insult. Thus, while they wished to support this temper, and to cherish their former affection, they felt with poignancy the invasion of their rights, and hourly expected the arrival of an armed force to back the threatenings of their first magistrate. Great prudence and moderation, however, marked the transactions of an assembly of men thus circumstanced. They could, in their present situation, only recapitulate their sufferings, felt and feared. This they did in a pointed and nervous style, in a letter addressed to Mr. de Burt, the agent of the province, residing in London. They stated the circumstances that occasioned their meeting, and a full detail of their proceedings. They enclosed him a petition to the king, and ordered their agent to deliver it with his own hand. The convention then separated, and returned to their respective towns, where they impressed on their constituents the same perseverance, forbearance, and magnanimity that had marked their own resolutions. Within a few days after their separation, the troops arrived from Halifax. This was indeed a painful era. The American War may be dated from the hostile parade of this day, a day which marks with infamy the councils of Britain. At this period, the inhabitants of the colonies almost universally breathed an unshaken loyalty to the King of England, and the strongest attachment to a country whence they derived their origin. Thus was the astonishment of the whole province excited, when, to the grief and consternation of the town of Boston, several regiments were landed, and marched sword in hand through the principal streets of their city, then in profound peace. The disembarkation of the king's troops, which took place on the 1st of October, 1768, was viewed by a vast crowd of spectators, who beheld the solemn prelude to devastation and bloodshed with a kind of sullen silence that denoted the deepest resentment. Yet, whatever might be the feelings of the citizens, not one among the gazing multitude discovered any disposition to resist by arms the power and authority of the King of Great Britain. This appearance of decent submission and order was very unexpected to some, whose guilty fears had led them to expect a violent and tumultuous resistance to the landing of a large body of armed soldiers in the town. The peaceable demeanor of the people was construed by the party who had brought this evil on the city as a mark of abject submission, as they supposed from the present acquiescent deportment that the spirit of the inhabitants was totally subdued on the first appearance of military power. They consequently rose in their demands. General Gage arrived from New York soon after the king's troops reached Boston. With the aid of the governor, the chief justice of the province, and the sheriff of the county of Suffolk, he forced quarters for his soldiers in all the unoccupied houses in the town. The council convened on this occasion, opposed the measure, but to such a height was the insolence of power pushed by their passionate, vindictive, and wrong-headed governor, that in spite of the remonstrations of several magistrates and the importunities of the people, he suffered the State House, where the archives of the province were deposited, to be improved as barracks for the king's troops. Thus the members of council, the magistrates of the towns, and the courts of justice were daily interrupted, and frequently challenged in their way to their several departments in business by military sentinels posted at the doors. A standing army thus placed in their capital, their commerce fettered, their characters traduced, their representative body prevented meeting, the united petitions of all ranks that they might be convened at this critical conjuncture, rejected by the governor, and still threatened with a further augmentation of troops to enforce measures in every view repugnant to the principles of the British Constitution. Little hope remained of a peaceful accommodation. The most rational arguments had been urged by the legislative assemblies, by corporate bodies, associations, and individual characters of eminence, to shake the arbitrary system that augured evils to both countries. But their addresses were disdainfully rejected. The king and the court of Great Britain appeared equally deaf to the cry of millions, who only asked a restoration of their rights. At the same time, every worthless incendiary, who, taking advantage of these miserable times, crossed the Atlantic with a tale of accusation against his country, was listened to with attention and rewarded with some token of royal favor. In this situation, no remedy appeared to be left short of an appeal to the sword, unless an entire suspension of that commercial intercourse, which had contributed so much to the glory and grandeur of Britain, could be effected throughout the colonies. As all the American continent was involved in one common danger, it was not found difficult to obtain a general combination against all further importations from England, a few articles only excepted. The mercantile body, through all the provinces, entered into solemn engagements, and plighted their faith and honor to each other and to their country, that no orders should be forwarded by them for British or India goods within a limited term, except for certain specified articles of necessary use. These engagements originated in Boston, and were for a time strictly adhered to through all the colonies. Great encouragement was given to American manufactures, and if pride of apparel was at all indulged, it was in wearing the stuffs fabricated in their own looms. Harmony and union, prudence and economy, industry and virtue were inculcated in their publications, and enforced by the example of the most respectable characters. In consequence of these determinations, the clamors of the British manufacturers arose to tumult in many parts of the kingdom, but no artifice was neglected to quiet the trading part of the nation. There were some Americans who by letters encouraged administration to persevere in their measures relative to the colonies, assuring them in the strongest terms that the interruption of commerce was but a temporary struggle, or rather an effort of despair. No one in the country urged his opinion with more indiscreet zeal than Andrew Oliver, Esquire, then secretary in the Massachusetts. He suggested that government should stipulate with the merchants in England to purchase large quantities of goods proper for the American market, agreeing beforehand to allow them a premium equal to the advance of their stock in trade, if the price of their goods was not sufficiently enhanced by a tenfold demand in future, even though the goods may lay on hand, till this temporary stagnation of business should cease. He concluded his political rhapsody with this inhuman boast to his correspondent: "By such a step, the game will be up with my countrymen." The prediction on both sides the Atlantic that this combination, which depended wholly on the commercial part of the community, could not be of long duration, proved indeed too true. A regard to private interest ever operates more forcibly on the bulk of mankind than the ties of honor, or the principles of patriotism, and when the latter are incompatible with the former, the balance seldom hangs long in equilibrio. Thus, it is not uncommon to see virtue, liberty, love of country, and regard to character sacrificed at the shrine of wealth. End of section 8. Section 9 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 3, Conclusion. The winter following this salutary combination, a partial repeal of the Act imposing duties on certain articles of British manufacture took place. On this, it immediately appeared that some in New York had previously given conditional orders to their correspondents that if the measures of Parliament should in any degree be relaxed, that without further application they should furnish them with large quantities of goods. Several in the other colonies had discovered as much avidity for an early importation as the Yorkers. They had given similar orders, and both received larger supplies than usual of British merchandise early in the spring 1769. The people, of course, considered the agreement nullified by the conduct of the merchants, and intercourse with England for a time went on as usual, without any check. Thus, by breaking through the agreement within the limited time of restriction, a measure was defeated, which, had it been religiously observed, might have prevented the tragical consequences which ensued. After this event, a series of altercation and abuse, of recrimination and suspense, was kept up on both sides the Atlantic, without much appearance of lenity on the one side, or decision on the other. There appeared little disposition in Parliament to relax the reins of government, and less in the Americans to yield implicit obedience. But whether from an opinion that they had taken the lead in opposition, or whether from their having a greater proportion of British sycophants among themselves, whole artful insinuations operated against their country, or from other concurring circumstances, the Massachusetts was still the principal butt of ministerial resentment. It is therefore necessary yet to continue no more particular detail of the situation of that province. As their charter was not yet annihilated, Governor Bernard found himself under a necessity, as the period of annual election approached, to issue writs to convene a General Assembly. Accordingly, a new House of Representatives met at Boston as usual on the 31st of May, 1769. They immediately petitioned the governor to remove the military parade that surrounded the State House, urging that such a hostile appearance might overawe their proceedings and prevent the freedom of election and debate. A unanimous resolve passed that it was the opinion of the House that placing an armed force in the metropolis while the General Assembly is there convened is a breach of privilege and totally inconsistent with the dignity and freedom with which they ought to deliberate and determine, adding that they meant ever to support their constitutional rights, that they should never voluntarily recede from their just claims, contained both in the letter and spirit of the Constitution. After several messages both from the Council and House of Representatives, the governor, ever obstinate in error, declared he had no authority of the king's troops, nor should he use any influence to have them removed. Thus, by express acknowledgment of the first magistrate, it appeared that the military was set so far above the civil authority that the last was totally unable to check the wanton exercise of this newly established power in the province. But the Assembly peremptorily determined to do no business, while thus insulted by the planting of cannon at the doors of the State House, and interrupted in their solemn deliberations by the noisy evolutions of military discipline. The Royal Charter required that they should proceed to the choice of a speaker and the election of a council, the first day of the meeting of the Assembly. They had conformed to this as usual, but protested against its being considered as a precedent on any future emergency. Thus, amidst the warmest expressions of resentment from all classes for the indignity offered a free people by this haughty treatment to their legislature, the governor suffered them to sit several weeks without doing business, and at last compelled them to give way to an armed force by adjourning the General Assembly to Cambridge. The internal state of the province required the attention of the House at this critical exigence of affairs. They therefore, on their first meeting at Cambridge, resolved that it was their opinion that the British Constitution admits no armed force within the realm, but for the purpose of offensive or defensive war, that placing troops in the colony in the midst of profound peace was a breach of privilege, an infraction on the natural rights of the people, and manifestly subversive of that happy form of government they had hitherto enjoyed, that the honor, dignity, and service of the sovereign should be attended to by that assembly, so far as was consistent with the just rights of the people, their own dignity, and the freedom of debate, but that proceeding to business while an armed force was quartered in the province was not dereliction of the privileges legally claimed by the colony, but from necessity, and that no undue advantage should be taken from their compliance. After this, they had not time to do any other business before two messages of a very extraordinary nature, in their opinion, were laid before them. The first was an order under the sign manual of the king, that Mr. Bernard should repair to England to lay the state of the province before him. To this message was tacked a request from the governor that as he attended His Majesty's pleasure as commander-in-chief of the province, his salary might be continued, though absent. The substance of the other message was an account of General Gage's expenditures in quartering his troops in the town of Boston, accompanied by an unqualified demand for the establishment of funds for the discharge thereof. The governor added that he was requested by General Gage to make requisition for future provision for quartering his troops within the town. The subsequent resolves of the House on these messages were conformable to the usual spirit of that assembly. They warmly censured both Governor Bernard and General Gage for wantonly acting against the Constitution, charged them with making false and injurious representations against His Majesty's faithful subjects, and discovering on all occasions a most inimical disposition towards the colonies. They observed that General Gage had rashly and impertinently intermeddled with affairs altogether out of his line, and that he had betrayed a degree of ignorance equal to his malice, when he presumed to touch on the civil police of the province. They complained heavily of the arbitrary designs of government, the introduction of a standing army, and the encroachments on civil liberty, and concluded with a declaration replete with sentiments of men conscious of their own freedom and integrity, and deeply affected with the injuries offered their country. They observed that to the utmost of their power they should vindicate the rights of human nature and the privileges of Englishmen, and explicitly declared that duty to their constituents forbade a compliance with either of these messages. This clear, decided answer being delivered, the governor summoned the House to attend, and after a short, angry, and threatening speech, he prorogued the assembly to January 1770. Governor Bernard immediately embarked for Europe, from whence he never was returned to a country he had, by his arbitrary disposition and indiscreet conduct, inflamed to a degree that required both judgment and prudence to cool, perhaps beyond the abilities and certainly incompatible with the views of the administration in being. The province had little reason to suppose that considerations of the interest of the people had any part in the recall or detention of this mischievous emissary. his reception at court, the summary proceedings with regard to his impeachment and trial, and the character of the man appointed to succeed him, strongly counteracted such a flattering opinion. Notwithstanding the high charges that had been alleged against Governor Bernard, he was acquitted by the king and council, without allowing time to the assembly to support their accusations, honored with the title, and rewarded with a pension of £1,000 sterling per annum on the Irish establishment. Governor Bernard had reason to be perfectly satisfied with the success of his appointment to the government of Massachusetts, as it related to his personal interest. His conduct there procured him the smiles of the British court, an honorary title, and a pension for life. Besides this, the legislature of that province had in the early part of his administration, in a moment of complacency, or perhaps from digested policy, with a hope of bribing him to his duty, and stimulating him to defend their invaded rights, made him a grant of a very large tract of land, the whole of the island of Mount Desert. This was afterwards reclaimed by a Madame Gregoire, in right of her ancestors, who had obtained a patent of some part of that country in the early days of European emigration. But as governor, Bernard's property in America had never been confiscated. The General Assembly of Massachusetts afterwards granted to his son, Sir John Bernard, who still possesses this territory, 2 townships of land near the river Kennebec, in lieu of the valuable isle recovered by Madame Gregoire. End of section 9.
Section 10 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 1, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 4, Part 1. It is ever painful to a candid mind to exhibit the deformed features of its own species. Yet truth requires a just portrait of the public delinquent, though he may possess such a share of private virtue as would lead us to esteem the man in his domestic character, while we detest his political and execrate his public transactions. The barriers of the British Constitution broken over, and the ministry encouraged by their sovereign to pursue the iniquitous system against the colonies to the most alarming extremities, they probably judged it a prudent expedient, in order to curb the refractory spirit of the Massachusetts, perhaps bolder in sentiment and earlier in opposition than some of the other colonies, to appoint a man to preside over them who had renounced the quondam ideas of public virtue and sacrificed all principle of that nature on the altar of ambition. Soon after the recall of Mr. Bernard, Thomas Hutchinson, Esquire, a native of Boston, was appointed to the government of Massachusetts. All who yet remember his pernicious administration and the fatal consequences that ensued agree that few ages have produced a more fit instrument for the purposes of a corrupt court. He was dark, intriguing, insinuating, haughty, and ambitious, while the extreme of avarice marked each feature of his character. His abilities were little elevated above the line of mediocrity. Yet by dint of industry, exact temperance, and indefatigable labor, he became master of the accomplishments necessary to acquire popular fame. Though bred a merchant, he had looked into the origin and the principles of the British Constitution, and made himself acquainted with the several forms of government established in the colonies. He had acquired some knowledge of the common law of England, diligently studied the intricacies of Machiavellian policy, and never failed to recommend the Italian master as a model to his adherents. Raised and distinguished by every honor the people could bestow, he supported for several years the reputation of integrity, and generally decided with equity in his judicial capacity. Note, He was judge of probate for the county of Suffolk and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. End note. And by the appearance of a tenacious regard to the religious institutions of his country, he courted the public éclat with the most profound dissimulation, while he engaged the affections of the lower classes by an amiable civility and condescension, without departing from a certain gravity of deportment mistaken by the vulgar for sanctity. The inhabitants of the Massachusetts were the lineal descendants of the Puritans, who had struggled in England for liberty as early as the reign of Edward VI, and though obscured in the subsequent bloody persecutions, even Mr. Hume has acknowledged that to them England is indebted for the liberty she enjoys. Note from Hume's History of England. Attached to the religious forms of their ancestors, equally disgusted with the hierarchy of the Church of England, and prejudiced by the severities their fathers had experienced before their emigration, they had, both by education and principle, been always led to consider the religious as well as the political characters of those they deputed to the highest truth. Thus, a profession of their own religious mode of worship, and sometimes a tincture of superstition, was with many a higher recommendation than brilliant talents. This accounts in some measure for the unlimited confidence long placed in the specious accomplishments of Mr. Hutchinson, whose character was not thoroughly investigated until some time after Governor Bernard left the province. But it was known at St. James that in proportion as Mr. Hutchinson gained the confidence of administration, he lost the esteem of the best of his countrymen. For this reason, his advancement to the chair of government was for a time postponed or concealed, lest the people should consider themselves insulted by such an appointment, and become too suddenly irritated. Appearances had for several years been strong against him, though it was not then fully known that he had seized the opportunity to undermine the happiness of the people while he had their fullest confidence, and to barter the liberties of his country by the most shameless duplicity. This was soon after displayed beyond all contradiction by the recovery of sundry letters to administration under his signature. Mr. Hutchinson was one of the first in America who felt the full weight of popular resentment. His furniture was destroyed, and his house leveled to the ground in the tumults occasioned by the news of the Stamp Act. Ample compensation was indeed afterwards made him for the loss of property, but the strong prejudices against his political character were never eradicated. All pretenses to moderation on the part of the British government now laid aside, the full appointment of Mr. Hutchinson to the government of Massachusetts was publicly announced at the close of the year 1769. On his promotion, the new governor uniformly observed a more high-handed and haughty tone than his predecessor. He immediately, by an explicit declaration, avowed his independence on the people, and informed the legislative that His Majesty had made ample provision for his support without their aid or suffrages. The vigilant guardians of the rights of the people directly called upon him to relinquish the unconstitutional stipend and to accept the free grants of the General Assembly for his subsistence, as usually practiced. He replied that an acceptance of this offer would be a breach of his instructions from the king. This was his constant apology for every arbitrary step. Secure of the favor of his sovereign, and now regardless of the popularity he had formerly courted with such avidity, he decidedly rejected the idea of responsibility to, or dependence on, the people. With equal inflexibility, he disregarded all arguments used for the removal of the troops from the capital and permission to the Council and House of Representatives to return to the usual seat of government. He silently heard their solicitations for this purpose, and as if with the design to pour contempt on their supplications and complaints, he within a few days after withdrew a garrison in the pay of the province from a strong fortress in the harbor of Boston, placed 2 regiments of the king's troops in their stead, and delivered the keys of the castle to Colonel Dalrymple, who then commanded the king's troops through the province. These steps, which seemed to bid defiance to complaint, created new fears in the minds of the people. It required the utmost vigilance to quiet the murmurs and prevent the fatal consequences apprehended from the ebullitions of popular resentment. But cool, deliberate, and persevering, the 2 houses continued to resolve, remonstrate, and protest against the infractions on their charter and every dangerous innovation on their rights and privileges. Indeed, the intrepid and spirited conduct of those who stood forth undaunted at this early crisis of hazard will dignify their names so long as the public records shall remain to witness their patriotic firmness. Many circumstances rendered it evident that the ministerial party wished a spirit of opposition to the designs of the court might break out into violence, even at the expense of blood. This, they thought, would in some degree have sanctioned a measure suggested by one of the faction in America, devoted to the arbitrary system, that some method must be devised to take off the original incendiaries whose writings instilled the poison of sedition through the vehicle of the Boston Gazette. 2 notes. First note, see Andrew Oliver's letter to one of the ministry, dated February 13, 1769. Second note, this Gazette was much celebrated for the freedom of its disquisitions in favor of civil liberty. It has been observed that, quote, it will be a treasury of political intelligence for the historians of this country. Otis, Thatcher, Dexter, Adams, Warren, and Quincy, Doctors Samuel Cooper and Mayhew, stars of the first magnitude in our northern hemisphere, whose glory and brightness distant ages will admire. These gentlemen of character and influence offered their first essays to the public through the medium of the Boston Gazette, on which account the paper became odious to the friends of prerogative, but not more disgusting to the Tories and High Church than it was pleasing to the Whigs. End quote. See collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. End notes. Had this advice been followed, and a few gentlemen of integrity and ability, who had spirit sufficient to make an effort in favor of their country in each colony, have been seized at the same moment and immolated early in the contest on the bloody altar of power, perhaps Great Britain might have held the continent in subjection a few years longer. That they had measures of this nature in contemplation, there is not a doubt. Several instances of a less atrocious nature confirmed this opinion, and the turpitude of design which at this period actuated the court party was clearly evinced by the attempted assassination of the celebrated Mr. Otis, justly deemed the first martyr to American freedom, and truth will enroll his name among the most distinguished patriots who have expired on the blood-stained theater of human action. This gentleman, whose birth and education was equal to any in the province, possessed an easy fortune, independent principles, a comprehensive genius, strong mind, retentive memory, and great penetration. To these endowments may be added that extensive professional knowledge which at once forms the character of the complete civilian and the able statesman. In his public speeches, the fire of eloquence, the acumen of argument, and the lively sallies of wit at once warmed the bosom of the Stoic and commanded the admiration of his enemies. To his probity and generosity in the public walks were added the charms of affability and improving converse in private life. His humanity was conspicuous, his sincerity acknowledged, his integrity unimpeached, his honor unblemished, and his patriotism marked with the disinterestedness of the Spartan. Yet he was susceptible of quick feelings and warm passions, which in the ebullitions of zeal for the interest of his country sometimes betrayed him into unguarded epithets that gave his foes an advantage, without benefit to the cause that lay nearest his heart. He had been affronted by the partisans of the crown, vilified in the public papers, and treated, after his resignation of office, note, office of Judge Advocate in Governor Bernard's administration, end note, in a manner too gross for a man of his spirit to pass over with impunity. Fearless of consequences, he had always given the world his opinions both in his writings and his conversation, and had recently published some severe strictures on the conduct of the commissioners of the customs and others of the ministerial party, and bidding defiance to resentment, he supported his allegations by the signature of his name. A few days after this publication appeared, Mr. Otis, with only one gentleman in company, was suddenly assaulted in a public room by a band of ruffians armed with swords and bludgeons. They were headed by John Robinson, one of the commissioners of the customs. The lights were immediately extinguished, and Mr. Otis, covered with wounds, was left for dead, while the assassins made their way through the crowd which began to assemble, and before their crime was discovered, fortunately for themselves, they escaped soon enough to take refuge on board one of the king's ships, which then lay in the harbor. In a state of nature, the savage may throw his poisoned arrow at the man whose soul exhibits a transcript of benevolence that upbraids his own ferocity, and may boast his bloodthirsty deed among the hordes of the forest without disgrace. But in a high stage of civilization, where humanity is cherished and politeness is become a science, for the dark assassin then to level his blow at superior merit and screen himself in the arms of power reflects an odium on the government that permits it and puts human nature to the blush. The party had a complete triumph in this guilty deed, for though the wounds did not prove mortal, the consequences were tenfold worse than death. The future usefulness of this distinguished friend of his country was destroyed, reason was shaken from its throne, genius obscured, and the great man in ruins lived several years for his friends to weep over, and his country to lament the deprivation of talents admirably adapted to promote the highest interests of society. This catastrophe shocked the feelings of the virtuous not less than it raised the indignation of the brave. Yet a remarkable spirit of forbearance continued for a time, owing to the respect still paid to the opinions of this unfortunate gentleman, whose voice, though always opposed to the strides of despotism, was ever loud against all tumultuous and illegal proceedings. He was, after a partial recovery, sensible himself of his incapacity for the exercise of talents that had shone with peculiar luster, and often invoked the messenger of death to give him a sudden release from a life become burdensome in every view, but when the calm interval of a moment permitted him the recollection of his own integrity. In one of those intervals of beclouded reason, he forgave the murderous band, after the principal ruffian had asked pardon in a court of justice. Note: on a civil process commenced against him, John Robinson was adjudged to pay £5,000 sterling damages, but Mr. Otis, despising all pecuniary compensation, relinquished it on the culprit's asking pardon and setting his signature to a very humble acknowledgment. End note. And at the intercession of the gentleman whom he had so grossly abused, the people forbear inflicting that summary vengeance which was generally thought due to so black a crime. Mr. Otis lived to see the independence of America, though in a state of mind incapable of enjoying fully the glorious event which his own exertions had precipitated. After several years of mental derangement, as if in consequence of his own prayers, his great soul was instantly set free by a flash of lightning from the evils in which the love of his country had involved him. His death took place in May, 1783, the same year the peace was concluded between Great Britain and America. Note: a sister touched by the tenderest feelings, while she has thought it her duty to do justice to a character neglected by some and misrepresented by other historians, can exculpate herself from all suspicion of partiality by the testimony of many of his countrymen who witnessed his private merit and public exertions. But she will, however, only subjoin a paragraph of a letter written to the author of these annals on the news of Mr. Otis's death by John Adams, Esquire, then Minister Plenipotentiary from the United States to the Court of France. Quote, Paris, September 10th, 1783. It was, madam, with very afflicting sentiments I learned the death of Mr. Otis, my worthy master. Extraordinary in death as in life, he has left a character that will never die, while the memory of the American Revolution remains, whose foundation he laid with an energy and with those masterly abilities which no other man possessed. End quote. The reader also may not be displeased at an extemporary exclamation of a gentleman of poetic talents on hearing of the death of Mr. Otis. Quote, When God in anger saw the spot on earth to Otis given, in thunder as from Sinai's mount, he snatched him back to heaven. End quote, end note. Though the parliamentary system of colonial regulations was in many instances similar, and equally aimed to curtail the privileges of each province, yet no military force had been expressly called in aid of civil authority in any of them except the Massachusetts. From this circumstance, some began to flatter themselves that more lenient dispositions were operating in the mind of the King of Great Britain, as well as in the Parliament and the people, towards America in general. They had grounded these hopes on the strong assurances of several of the plantation governors, particularly Lord Bouttourt, who then presided in Virginia. He had in a speech to the Assembly of the Colony in the winter of 1769 declared himself so confident that full satisfaction would be given to the provinces in the future conduct of administration that he pledged his faith to support to the last hour of his life the interest of America. He observed that he grounded his own opinions and his assurances to them on the intimations of the confidential servants of the king, which authorized him to promise redress. He added that to his certain knowledge his sovereign had rather part with his crown than preserve it by deception. The credulity of this gentleman was undoubtedly imposed upon. However, the Virginians, ever steady and systematic in opposition to tyranny, were for a time highly gratified by those assurances from their first magistrate. But their vigilance was soon called into exercise by the maladministration of a succeeding governor, though the fortitude of this patriotic colony was never shaken by the frown of any despotic master or masters. Some of the other colonies had listened to the soothing language of moderation used by their chief executive officers and were for a short time influenced by that and the flattering hopes held up by the governor of Virginia. But before the period to which we have arrived in the narration of events, these flattering appearances had evaporated with the breath of the courtier. The subsequent conduct of administration baffled the expectations of the credulous. The hand of government was more heavily felt through the continent, and from South Carolina to Virginia, and from Virginia to New Hampshire, the mandate of a minister was the signal for the dissolution of their assemblies. The people were compelled to resort to conventions and committees to transact all public business, to unite in petitions for relief, or to take the necessary preparatory steps if finally obliged to resist by arms. End of section 10.